The man known to history as Caesar Augustus was born on the 23rd of September 63 BC on the Palatine Hill in the city of Rome, the capital of the then Roman Republic. In Roman times, individuals often had many different names, some being constructs to acknowledge great deeds or the manner in which they wanted to depict themselves. Consequently, Caesar Augustus is a constructed name which he later came to be known by. The man who would one day become the first emperor of Rome was actually born as Gaius Octavius or Gaius Octavian, and is typically referred to in his youth and early adult years as Octavian. His father, also Gaius Octavius, was a member of the Octavia Roman clan from the equestrian class. The Octavia were not part of the senatorial aristocracy, but had risen to a position of considerable significance in Rome by the 1st century BC, as a result of several generations of the family providing military and political service to the Republic. As a result, Gaius was considered a novus homo, or a new man. This was a term which was applied to many individuals who had risen to positions of wealth and authority in Rome, but who came from socially inferior clans, as a way of differentiating them from the patrician classes of the senatorial families, who could trace their lineage back several centuries. Octavian's mother was Attia Balba, a daughter of Marcus Attius Balbus, a Roman politician who served as a praetor of Rome, one of the Republic's senior magistrates, the year after Octavian was born, and his wife Julia Minor, the sister of Julius Caesar. Thus, Octavian was born into a notable Roman political family on both his mother's and his father's sides. Octavian's very first years were turbulent. The city of Rome had increased dramatically in population and size during the late 2nd century BC and early 1st century BC. As it became increasingly overcrowded, many richer families of Roman citizens elected to spend more time outside the city at their villas and estates around Italy. Octavian's family were no different, and he was quickly sent to the family ancestral lands at Velletri, approximately 40 kilometers south of Rome. However, the more significant development in his early years was the death of his father in 59 BC, when Octavian was still shy of his 4th birthday. His mother quickly remarried to Lucius Marius Philippus, a member of a senior Roman aristocratic family. But this was not an ideal marriage for young Octavian, as Marius took little interest in his new stepson. As a result, Octavian was largely placed in the care of his grandmother Julia in the 50s BC, whose brother, Gaius Julius Caesar, would play a major role in Octavian's younger years, as well as his ascent to become Emperor of Rome. Octavian was evidently very close to his grandmother, and when she died in 51 BC, he gave the funeral oration despite being only 12 years old. It is not possible to understand Octavian's subsequent life without examining the politics of Rome in the first half of the 1st century BC. Octavian was born into a volatile period in the history of the Roman Republic. On the one hand, Rome had never been more powerful. Beginning in the 3rd century BC, the Republic had begun expanding from its small base in central Italy, first coming to dominate the western Mediterranean after 2 major wars against its rival, the city-state of Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. Rome emerged victorious from what were known as the Punic Wars, and by the early 2nd century BC was in control of all of Italy and much of Spain. Further rapid conquests occurred in the century that followed, effectively bringing southern Gaul, Carthage itself, and Greece under the rule of Rome. These conquests would continue unabated in the decades leading up to Octavian's birth. But there was a contradiction at the heart of Rome's expansion. While its military power increased, the Republic itself was in mortal danger as the generals of the Roman legions became ever more powerful. And in 83 BC, a civil war had even broken out between the 2 foremost Roman generals of the age, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla emerged victorious from this in 81 BC and became dictator of Rome. And while he did resign that position in 79 BC and restore the Republic a year before his own death, many wondered how long it would be before another general emerged to seize power on a more permanent basis. The answer to that particular question, many at Rome imagined, would lie amongst the three individuals who had formed a loose political alliance in 60 BC, just 3 years after Octavian was born. The most famous of the three at the time was Pompeius Magnus. He had risen as a supporter of Sulla in the 80s BC, but he had carved out his own path between 79 BC and the mid-60s BC by leading Roman armies to several great victories in the eastern Mediterranean, bringing regions like Syria under Roman rule and earning the name Pompey the Great in the process. Like Pompey, Marcus Licinius Crassus had been a follower of Sulla's before rising to prominence himself by becoming the richest man in the Republic and crushing the rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus in southern Italy in the late 70s BC. The third member of what became known as the First Triumvirate was the only one who had been on the side of Marius in the earlier civil war. Despite this, Gaius Julius Caesar had managed to return to prominence in Rome in the 70s and 60s BC after he obtained several senior political offices and then conquered parts of Hispania on the Iberian Peninsula in the late 60s BC. As noted, Caesar was the brother of Octavian's grandmother Julia, and in the 50s BC, as Octavian was growing up, these three men would vie to become the dominant figure in the Roman Republic. As Octavian entered his teenage years, the political situation was taking another major turn. During the 50s BC, the three triumvirs had experienced varying fortunes. Crassus led an army against the Parthian Empire in what is now Iraq in the mid-50s BC, and in 53 BC he was killed at the Battle of Carrhae, in what was one of the worst defeats ever experienced by Roman forces. Conversely, Caesar had undertaken in the early 50s BC to conquer Gaul, the region approximating with modern-day France, and which was then inhabited by a great number of Celtic tribes. He was enormously successful in this enterprise, effectively extending the northern borders of the Roman Republic from the Alps all the way north to the English Channel and the North Sea in the space of a few years in the 50s BC. Meanwhile, as Caesar's star was in the ascendant in Gaul, Pompey floundered in Rome, unable to acquire a military command which would raise his status back to what it had been in years gone by. But he still had strong support from the Roman Senate, which viewed Caesar and his growing power as a potential mortal threat to the Republic. Thus, a new civil war was brewing, one between Caesar, backed by much of the Roman army, and Pompey, backed by the Senate. Octavian would soon grow closer to his great-uncle during the 40s BC, at the same time as Caesar was emerging as the Sulla of his age. In 50 BC, relations between Pompey's faction in Rome and Caesar in Gaul had reached a crisis point. Anxious to limit Caesar's power, the Roman Senate was attempting to prevent him standing for a new term as consul of Rome, the highest political office in the Republic, and they were also trying to strip him of his military command. Pressured by these efforts, Caesar brought his armies south from Gaul towards Italy and on the 10th of January 49 BC crossed the Rubicon River in northeast Italy. This was a boundary beyond which no Roman general was allowed to bring his troops, and in crossing it, Caesar was effectively initiating a civil war. In the weeks that followed, Pompey and his followers evacuated Italy and headed for the eastern Mediterranean. Greece now became the main theatre of operations, where Caesar initially lost the Battle of Dyrrhachium in July 48 BC, but followed it up with a resounding victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus just weeks later. Pompey subsequently fled to Egypt, where he was killed by the Ptolemaic regime. The civil war would drag on for 3 more years in mopping up operations in parts of North Africa and Spain, but the events of 48 BC had effectively left Caesar in command of the Roman Republic. There is a popular misconception that Julius Caesar now became the first emperor of Rome. This is not true. Caesar held the title of dictator during the 40s BC. This should not be confused with the modern idea of a dictator who holds absolute power and refuses to accept any challenges to their authority. In Rome, dictatorial powers were regularly given by the Roman Senate to an individual to hold extensive authority in civil and military affairs during a period of crisis. Thus, for instance, the Roman politician and general Quintus Fabius Maximus was granted dictatorial powers by the Senate in 217 BC during the Second Punic War, when the Carthaginian general Hannibal had invaded Italy by bringing an army over the Alps from Carthage's European base in Spain. He relinquished these powers after a short time, as had Sulla just 2 years after he won the civil war against Marius in the late 80s BC. As such, Caesar was operating within a relatively normal constitutional arrangement when he served as dictator in the 40s BC. But what was at issue was that as the years went by, it seemed that he would never relinquish his dictatorial powers. However, it is important to note that he never made himself emperor of Rome, and that constitutional novelty would be an invention of Octavian's ascent to power 20 years later. During this period of immense political change, young Octavian had been growing closer to his great-uncle and also finding his own way in the world of Roman politics. Following his grandmother's death, he had gone back to live with his own mother and stepfather. In 47 BC, when he was just 15, he was elected to the College of Pontiffs, a caste of Roman priests, while in 46 BC, he played a significant role in organizing the version of the Olympic Games, which were held at this time. He was also anxious to prove himself militarily and had petitioned his mother from early on in the Civil War to be allowed to join his great-uncle on campaigns. She initially refused, but eventually acquiesced towards the end of the conflict, and Octavian saw some of the last actions of the war in Hispania in 46 BC, where the remnants of Pompey's supporters were making their last stand. Octavian evidently made a major impression on Caesar, who sometime in late 46 BC or 45 BC altered his will to both adopt Octavian and make him his principal heir. Adoptions of this kind were very common amongst the Roman nobility at the time, and Octavian's position as the primary beneficiary of Caesar's will was relatively uncomplicated by the fact that Caesar did not have any legitimate male heirs of his own, although he had fathered an illegitimate son with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra in 47 BC. Caesar's adoption of Octavian and his naming of him as the primary beneficiary of his will were more vital than Caesar could have known at the time that he made that decision, for ultimately the Roman dictator was not long for the world. As the months rolled by after the end of the Civil War, with Caesar giving no indication that he intended to renounce his dictatorial powers, a conspiracy was developing amongst the ranks of the Roman Senate to assassinate him. Although word of the conspiracy slipped out shortly before the assassination was to take place, the individual who learned of it, one of Caesar's closest commanders from his days in Gaul, Marcus Antonius, typically known as Mark Antony, was prevented from alerting Caesar to the danger he was in. Accordingly, when Caesar entered the Senate on the 15th of March, the Ides of March, 44 BC, one of the great festival days in the Roman calendar, he did not know what was about to occur. In the minutes that followed, a group of senators surrounded him and began stabbing him furiously. Most near-contemporary accounts agree that Caesar did not say anything as he was swiftly killed, and the idea, popularized later in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, that the great commander turned to one of his assailants, Marcus Brutus, a former protege of his, and said, "Et tu, Brute," meaning, "and you, Brutus," is most likely a colorful invention. Octavian was not in Rome at the time of Caesar's assassination, but was undertaking military training in Illyria, the region of the west of the Adriatic Sea, corresponding with modern-day Croatia and Albania. The later Roman historical biographer Suetonius stated that Octavian considered whether he should try to assemble an army from amongst the Roman legions in order to claim power when he heard of his great-uncle's death. But this is unlikely, given Octavian was still just 18 years of age at this time. He did head straight for Rome, though, upon learning of Caesar's death, and it would only have been at this time that he learned that Caesar had made him the primary beneficiary of his very sizable estate. Moreover, the fact that Caesar had adopted Octavian made him the successor to his great-uncle's political power in the eyes of Caesar's many followers. Thus, although he was still a very young man, With only limited experience of military campaigning, Octavian had both the financial power and the support network which was needed to begin asserting himself in Rome's politics in the power vacuum which followed his great-uncle's assassination in 44 BC. To broadcast his role as Caesar's political heir, he adopted his name at this point, adding Caesar to his titles. While the clique of Roman senators who had assassinated Caesar had intended to restore republican rule, they were soon frustrated in their efforts. Within weeks, figures such as Brutus had been forced to flee Rome following an inflammatory eulogy given by Mark Antony at Caesar's funeral, in which he denounced the conspirators. In the months that followed, they would be condemned as traitors, as Caesar's supporters reasserted some control over the government. And with individuals such as Brutus out of the way, Roman politics once again descended into a battle between a number of military commanders and interested groups to see who could succeed Caesar as the new dictator of the Republic. Foremost amongst the possible candidates was Mark Antony, who was serving as consul at the time and who was in a position of strength. Yet others were wary of Antony, viewing him as an individual who would simply become the next in a line of over-mighty political generals, which included Sulla and Caesar in recent times. This faction began to give their support to Octavian and others such as Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, another one of Caesar's close allies from Gaul and the Civil War. The emergence of these opposing factions would ensure that no one individual would succeed Caesar in the immediate aftermath of his assassination. Despite his youth and relative inexperience, Octavian showed just how astute a politician he could be within weeks. In the months following Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, he had acquired vast sums of money in Italy. Part of this was the war chest of 700 million sesterces, or silver coins, which had been accumulated in southern Italy to pay for a massive military campaign, which Caesar had been planning at the time of his death against Rome's foremost enemy, the Parthian Empire far to the east in Mesopotamia. Octavian had reappropriated a substantial amount of this money to himself, and then had augmented it by effectively stealing the enormous tribute which arrived from Rome's client states in the eastern Mediterranean later that year. Now, in late 44 BC and early 43 BC, he put this money to good use, bribing 2 of Mark Antony's legions to follow him, and also recruiting thousands of Caesar's former supporters across Italy. To copper fasten his swift seizure of Italy, Octavian had himself made a senator, and in a highly unusual move, was quickly given the right to vote on certain matters which were usually reserved for senators who had previously served as consuls. Finally, in mid-43 BC, he marched on Rome with several legions and demanded to be made consul himself, as both the consuls who had been appointed for the year had died in military campaigns. He encountered virtually zero opposition, and as a result, the 19-year-old became the sole consul, the most significant political office in the Republic. Octavian had clearly emerged as a significant political figure on a par with Mark Antony and Lepidus. The emergence of these rivals for power soon led to a new political arrangement in Rome, which mirrored that which had been agreed to by Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey in 60 BC. On the 27th of November 43 BC, the Roman Senate passed the Lex Titia, a law which formally divided power within the Roman Republic between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. This second triumvirate, as it has become known, differed in significant ways from the earlier first triumvirate. The first had effectively been a private and informal agreement between Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey to cooperate with each other, while the second triumvirate was a formal agreement which had the backing of the Senate and effectively divided the Republic into 3 spheres of influence which the 3 triumvirs would rule. Octavian was given control over the region corresponding to Tunisia and Libya in North Africa, as well as Sardinia and Corsica. Hispania and southern Gaul were granted to Lepidus, while Mark Antony controlled the Alpine region and most of Gaul. The Senate would control Rome itself and Italy, while much of the Republic's territories in the eastern Mediterranean had fallen into the hands of others such as Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had assassinated Caesar. As these lands in the east constituted the richer parts of the empire, whichever of the triumvirs could seize the region would be best placed to emerge victorious amongst the triumvirs in the years that followed. The first years of the Second Triumvirate saw Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus acting cordially and in conjunction with each other. Firstly, they began strengthening their position by proscribing former opponents of Caesar's. Proscription was a process whereby Roman citizens were effectively outlawed by the Republic and had their estates confiscated. By proscribing hundreds of wealthy individuals, the three triumvirs came into possession of vast estates and wealth which they used to reward their followers and strengthen their own factions. Together, the three began the work of crushing those who had assassinated Caesar and who had taken control of much of Rome's territories in the eastern Mediterranean. Octavian and Mark Antony took the lead in this, bringing 28 legions across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. From there they marched north and met with the forces led by Brutus and Cassius near Philippi in Macedonia. The resulting battle involved upwards of 200,000 men. In the clash, casualties were actually relatively limited, and no side was the clear victor in military terms. However, when Cassius was given false information that Brutus's forces had been defeated, he committed suicide, and Brutus did the same when he learned of Cassius's actual fate. Thereafter their forces surrendered. It was a bizarre end to the wars which followed from Caesar's assassination. The power dynamics of the Second Triumvirate shifted considerably in the aftermath of the victory at Philippi. Lepidus, who had always been the least powerful of the three triumvirs, was quickly marginalized on the back of a spurious lie invented by Octavian and Mark Antony, that he had been secretly providing aid to Sextus Pompeius, a son of Pompey the Great, who had seized control of Sicily in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination. With Lepidus removed in this way, Octavian and Mark Antony agreed on a new division of power, whereby Octavian would effectively control the western parts of the Republic, notably Italy, Gaul, Hispania, and the North African provinces, while Mark Antony would control the eastern provinces such as Greece and Syria, as well as exercising influence over the many client kingdoms in this region, such as Ptolemaic Egypt, which were not formally part of the Roman Republic, but which were effectively vassals who paid tribute to Rome. Then, to cement the new dispensation, an agreement was reached whereby Antony married Octavian's sister Octavia in October 40 BC. The alliance, as uneasy as it was, would hold for nearly a decade. One of Octavian's most pressing problems following the effective division of the Republic between himself and Antony was the presence of Sextus Pompeius in Sicily. Pompeius had ensconced himself firmly on the island, which sat right on the shipping routes between the western and eastern Mediterranean, and he had even managed to gain a hold of Sardinia and Corsica, having built up a formidable navy, by attacking and seizing shipping passing by the islands from the eastern Mediterranean to Rome. Pompeius was able to interfere in the supplies of grain and other foodstuffs to Rome. The Eternal City was heavily reliant on such deliveries from Egypt and other countries to feed its swelling population and provide the famous bread dole to its citizens. Consequently, something needed to be done to remove Pompeius from Sicily. Initially, an agreement was brokered in 39 BC, the Pact of Misenum, whereby Sextus was acknowledged in his possession of the islands if he would cease attacking Roman shipping. However, once his plundering recommenced, after a few months, Octavian determined to act and sent his foremost commander, Marcus Agrippa, to crush Sextus, a feat which he eventually accomplished in 36 BC. Pompeius fled to the east, where he was captured on the Greek island of Miletus and executed the following year. The conclusion of the war against Pompeius in Sicily also led to a further disintegration of the Second Triumvirate. Lepidus had been sidelined years earlier, but the removal of Sextus from the Italian islands in 36 BC now saw him try to re-establish himself by seizing Sicily. Octavian made clear his dominance of the western Mediterranean in the months that followed by sending his armies south, upon which Lepidus's own legions defected to Caesar's adopted heir. Octavian had once again shown his belief that gold was the key to loyalty here, and had made it known to Lepidus's legions but they would receive generous payments if they relinquished their allegiance to their commander. As a result of their defection, the third triumvir was stripped of all his political offices by Octavian, other than the largely ceremonial position of Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest of Rome. Yet Lepidus was allowed to retire peacefully to Cape Circei, not far from Rome, and he would live for nearly another quarter of a century once he agreed to largely stay out of Roman politics. But the immediate consequence of his fall in the mid-30s BC was that there were now definitely only two triumvirs left, and the showdown between Octavian and Mark Antony loomed ever nearer. While Octavian was enjoying these successes in the west, Antony was experiencing some trouble in the east. In the late 40s BC, Antony had struck up a relationship with Cleopatra, the queen of Ptolemaic Egypt, who had previously been the lover of Julius Caesar and had even borne him a son named Caesarion. Making his base in Egypt in the early 30s BC, Antony had determined to strengthen his position relative to Octavian by undertaking further conquests on the eastern borders of the Republic. In particular, he was anxious to rejuvenate Caesar's earlier plans to make war on the Parthian Empire in Mesopotamia. Thus, in 36 BC, he invaded Parthia with a massive force. However, the invasion soon turned to disaster as Antony's main force was separated from the baggage trains of supplies and siege equipment. When a mobile force of Parthian cavalry intercepted and destroyed much of the latter, the Roman general was forced to retreat back towards Roman territory in Syria, losing further men along the way as his forces were harried by the Parthians. The campaign had turned into a disaster, the embarrassment of which was only partially remedied by his conquest of the kingdom of Armenia in 34 BC and the installation of his son Alexander Helios as its king. This was the context in which Octavian made his major grab for total power over the Republic. Antony's absence from the Eternal City, his relationship with Cleopatra and seeming preference for the Egyptian capital of Alexandria over Rome, and the nepotism he showed towards his followers in the east, all provided ammunition for Octavian and his faction to begin claiming that Antony wished to seize power in the Republic and begin building a new realm of which Egypt and the city of Alexandria would be the heartland. Octavian was particularly bullish in claiming this, as he was angered by Antony's embarrassing of his sister Octavia, to whom Antony was still married, through his very public relationship with Cleopatra. Moreover, Octavian was actually able to substantiate his claims that Antony was Orientalizing. In 32 BC, he entered the Temple of the Vestal Virgins in Rome and removed Antony's will, which was housed there. With this, he was able to demonstrate that Antony had plans to divide up the Republic's eastern territories between his family and supporters, and that he wished to be entombed at Alexandria following his death. This, combined with Antony's celebration of his conquest of Armenia by holding a triumph in Alexandria rather than at Rome, seemed to confirm Octavian's argument that Antony was effectively turning into an eastern despot who would expel Rome from its eastern territories if left unchecked. In late 32 BC, following this campaign to undermine Antony, the Senate in Rome finally agreed to revoke Antony's powers and declared war on Ptolemaic Egypt. A new civil war had begun, yet Octavian did not have unequivocal support in the West. As much as 40% of the Roman Senate had voted against the war, and a large majority of these now left the capital and headed east with their supporters to join Antony's cause in Egypt. In the months that followed, the largest military build-up that had accompanied any Roman civil war occurred. By the summer of 31 BC, Octavian had pulled together forces which numbered approximately 200,000 men. To put this in perspective, Caesar had only commanded roughly 25,000 men at the Battle of Pharsalus, the decisive engagement in his civil war against Pompey in the early autumn of 48 BC. And Octavian's massive military buildup was matched by Antony, who was also able to field about 200,000 men. Just as significantly, both quickly assembled large fleets of hundreds of galleys, as this was a war which would play itself out as much in the Mediterranean as on land. By the summer, both sides were channeling their armies towards Greece, which, like Caesar and Pompey's showdown in 48 BC and the end of Brutus and Cassius's revolt at Philippi in 42 BC, would act as the theatre in which yet another civil conflict of the late Roman Republic would play out. Octavian and Mark Antony's forces would finally clash at sea near the Roman colony of Actium in northwestern Greece in 31 BC. This was at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, approximately 50 kilometers south of the southern tip of the island of Corfu. Antony had begun assembling his land and sea forces here in the summer of 31 BC, in preparation for a planned strike against mainland Italy. Octavian responded by concentrating his forces on the Greek mainland opposite Corfu, to the north of Actium. Here, by the late summer, Octavian was beginning to gain the upper hand, as his strength relative to Antony's grew, and Antony became increasingly surrounded on the mainland. Then, as the days went by, desertion and disease began decimating his forces. As a result, on the 2nd of September 31 BC, he attempted to break out from the Ambracian Gulf, with slightly over 300 ships and perhaps as many as 25,000 infantry and cavalry on board. Octavian's forces of roughly 400 galleys, under the overall command of Marcus Agrippa, had lined up in the waters around the exit from the Gulf, as Antony's fleet sailed past Actium to try to break out into the wider Mediterranean. The Battle of Actium, which followed, would be the decisive conflict of the civil war. Octavian's fleet was numerically superior, but his ships of an Italian build were smaller than the larger galleys of Antony's eastern fleet. However, even this seeming advantage for Antony was diluted by the fact that Octavian's ships proved more agile and could stay out of range of fire from Antony's vessels in the hours that followed. However, what possibly sealed his fate at Actium was that his ships became caught in dead water while trying to break out of the Ambracian Gulf, a marine phenomenon whereby ships can only move at a fraction of their normal speed due to being caught in highly saline water. This, or perhaps a run of bad winds, stranded many of Antony's ships for long enough that Octavian's galleys were able to come close enough to start many fires on the decks of Antony's own galleys. This, combined with a breakdown in communication between the different parts of Antony's fleet, saw his fleet almost completely destroyed in the hours that followed. As night time descended near Actium, Mark Antony's hopes of defeating Octavian were ablaze across the waters outside the Ambracian Gulf. In the aftermath of Actium, Antony managed to escape back to Egypt. Octavian and Marcus Agrippa pursued him, and Antony eventually committed suicide by falling on his own sword on the 1st of August 30 BC, after another defeat at Alexandria. This brought the latest civil war, the final civil war of the Roman Republic, to an end. Cleopatra followed her lover's example 9 days later and killed herself by drinking poison, not, as legend would have it, through the bite of an asp. And Octavian was not inclined to show mercy to those who had survived. Both Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, and Marcus Antonius Antyllus, Mark Antony's son by his earlier wife Fulvia, were executed. The two had been born within weeks of each other in 47 BC, and were consequently in their late teens in 30 BC. Octavian had not been much older himself when Caesar was assassinated, and he began his political and military ascent. Unwilling to take any risks that the pair would one day pose a threat to him, he had them killed. Egypt, which had been a client state of Rome's up until 30 BC, was formally annexed to become the latest province of the Roman Republic. Like Caesar before him, Octavian did not move to immediately establish himself as Emperor of Rome, although he was now unrivaled in the same way Caesar had been between 48 BC and 44 BC. Unwilling to make the mistake his great-uncle had made of claiming dictatorial powers and never relinquishing them, or asking the Senate's consent, he instead began slowly changing his own constitutional position in the months and years following the end of the civil war in 30 BC. Firstly, after returning to Rome, he had himself and Marcus Agrippa made consuls for the year, and he would hold the title every year down to the late 20s BC. In tandem, Octavian tightened his grip on the military and also began diverting the Republic's wealth into his own coffers in ways which allowed him to bestow enormous amounts of financial patronage. Then he reached an agreement with the Senate that he would divide control over the Republic's provinces between them, whereby Octavian and his magistrates administered some, and the Senate others. And by this means he created the idea that he was ruling with the consent of the Senate and the old aristocracy, instead of bludgeoning it into obedience, as Caesar had attempted. For all that these changes magnified Octavian's position in the aftermath of his victory over Antony, it was not until 27 BC that the real change in the constitutional status of the Republic and his position within it was transformed. In January of that year, the Senate granted Octavian 2 new titles. The first of these was that of princeps, meaning first or the foremost within a group. The new title signified that Octavian was now the first citizen of Rome. The other title which was bestowed was that of Augustus, roughly meaning illustrious one, as a term of reverence. Octavian now took the latter, along with his great-uncle's cognomen, as his new name. Henceforth he would be known as Caesar Augustus, while he styled himself as Imperator, a term which in Latin effectively means commander, but the meaning of which today is emperor or ruler, based largely on the knowledge that the imperators who ruled after Augustus were emperors of a Roman Empire. And these developments in January of 27 BC are consequently generally interpreted as the point at which the Roman Republic came to an end and the date from which we can speak of the Roman Empire, one which would last for nearly exactly 500 years thereafter. Having established himself in a position of secure and supreme authority in Rome, Augustus soon set about expanding the empire's borders. Rome was a society, whether it was ruled as a republic or as an empire, which viewed expansion as a natural thing for it to do at all times. In the early years of Augustus's rule, this came quite easily. Egypt had been annexed as part of the end of the civil war. The kingdom of Galatia in central Turkey was also converted into a Roman province in 25 BC when its ruler, Amyntas, was killed. In the years that followed that, Augustus succeeded in crushing the independent tribes of northern Hispania, which had resisted Roman rule for 2 centuries. The final conquest of the Iberian Peninsula by 19 BC was especially beneficial, as huge gold deposits were soon discovered there, leading to a massive financial windfall for both Augustus and the wider Roman aristocracy. In tandem, Augustus tightened Roman control over the client kingdoms of the Near East, such as the Herodian Kingdom of Judea, by the end of the 20s BC. Finally, a diplomatic success was also secured with the Parthian Empire to return the battle standards of the Roman legions, which had been lost at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, in which Crassus, Julius Caesar's associate in the First Triumvirate, had perished. Yet it was not all plain sailing during these years. In the spring of 23 BC, Augustus became seriously ill, and many believed he was on his deathbed. Therefore, he made provisions at this time for a division of power upon his death, whereby Marcus Agrippa would succeed him militarily, and his nephew Marcus Claudius Marcellus would be groomed to succeed him politically in the long run. Although he recovered from the illness, the entire episode made Augustus acutely conscious of the necessity for a clearer constitutional arrangement, and during the course of 23 BC, he agreed with the Senate that henceforth he would not appoint himself as consul, but would be granted the office of tribune for life, with the powers of a Roman censor combined with this. In this way, he placated the Senate by giving back the office of consul, but retained great control over the magistracy by the creation of an entirely new office under the name of tribune. And while these new arrangements did incite some unrest, most notably a shadowy conspiracy which was launched by one Fannius Scipio in 21 BC, these threats were easily seen off, and Augustus continued to solidify his rule into the 10s BC. Augustus's reign saw many innovations in terms of how Roman society was governed and managed. The century or so prior to his seizure of power had seen the Roman state expand dramatically, but necessary social reforms had been neglected as the Republic struggled through successive civil wars. In particular, There were major issues in the Eternal City itself, which was suffering from fires, diseases, a crime problem, and growing poverty. Augustus began addressing this imbalance. In the city of Rome, the population of which had swelled to upwards of 1 million people by the 1st century AD, he transformed the municipal government, instituting the first professional police force and fire service in a city where violent assaults and accidental fires had become rampant. These vigiles did much to make Rome a more hospitable place by the end of his reign. He also drastically reformed the way in which Rome and the Italian peninsula were administered, expanding the personal bodyguard he had established for himself early in his career, the Praetorian Guard, to become a much larger unit whose loyalty was directly to the emperor, and which was charged with the protection of the capital and the Italian peninsula. In the wider empire, Augustus, in conjunction with the Senate, established the system of administration which would last for much of the next 2 centuries. This divided the empire into senatorial provinces, which the Senate administered, and imperial provinces, which were administered by magistrates appointed directly by the emperor. There were some exceptions to this rule. Egypt, which had been conquered following the Battle of Actium, was one of the richest provinces of the entire empire, and Augustus placed it under the administration of a prefect from the Roman equestrian class, who was directly responsible to him. And he also introduced major reforms to the Roman tax base, which increased the imperial revenues that were collected. This was a necessity, as for decades Rome had relied on extracting resources from conquered territories for much of its wealth. In introducing a proper taxation system of land and trade, Augustus was creating a more stable and secure source of revenue for the empire. Finally, in order to improve the overall administration of the empire, Augustus initiated a massive road-building system and a system of relay stations complete with horses to deliver information at maximum speed to and from Rome. As a result, King Louis XIV, nearly 2,000 years later, would not have been able to send a messenger any faster than Augustus could. The reign of Augustus is generally perceived as having been a golden age of Roman culture, particularly of Latin literature. The poet Horace published his odes between 23 BC and 13 BC, while Ovid composed several renowned works such as the Metamorphoses, a narrative of combined Hellenic Romano mythology, and his Ars Amatoria, meaning the art of love, and the Fasti, a volume of the Roman calendar, all towards the latter end of Augustus's reign. The historian Livy spent nearly 30 years during Augustus's reign composing an enormous history of Rome, from the foundation of the city down to Augustus's reign, entitled Ab Urbe Condita, meaning from the founding of the city. Yet it was Virgil, an Italian from near modern-day Mantua, who became the greatest of the Roman poets. His magnum opus, the Aeneid, providing a national epic of Rome's mythical establishment by Aeneas, a refugee from the legendary siege and fall of the city of Troy. Many of these poets were supported by Gaius Maecenas, one of Augustus's right-hand men, who acted as an unofficial minister of culture, and the emperor's role in this flowering of Latin literature was considerable, although Augustus did exile Ovid to the city of Tomis beyond the empire's borders in Romania in 8 AD under mysterious circumstances, possibly related to the scandals created by his love poetry. The Augustan Golden Age extended beyond the written word. Rome's first emperor left an indelible mark on the built environment of the city. He was responsible for constructing numerous major monumental buildings in the center of the city, notably the Forum of Augustus, complete with a temple to Mars Ultor, and the Triumphal Arch of Augustus, while the Mausoleum of Augustus, which he built shortly after the end of the Civil War, covered an area the size of several city streets along the banks of the river Tiber and became the resting place of the remains of all the Julio-Claudian emperors and many members of Augustus's extended family. Other buildings, such as the Portico of Octavian, which was built in honor of the emperor's sister, and the Baths of Agrippa, the city's first public baths, constructed by Augustus's most trusted ally Marcus Agrippa, were built either by or on behalf of the emperor's family and friends. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Given all this building work, the foremost work on Roman architecture, De Architectura, was written by the engineer and architect Vitruvius during the first decade of Augustus's reign. It was still being used as a major work in the field as late as the 18th century, and Vitruvius's writings were used in such famous buildings as the Dome, which Filippo Brunelleschi built on top of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence in the 15th century. Throughout his reign, there continued to be widespread speculation as to who, if anyone, would succeed Augustus in the unique position he had carved out for himself within the Roman state. Augustus had married 3 times. His first 2 marriages were brief affairs. The first, to Claudia between 42 BC and 40 BC, was a political marriage designed to shore up alliances during the politically turbulent years following Caesar's assassination. The second, to Scribonia, followed immediately after his divorce from Claudia, but similarly it only lasted 2 years, down to 38 BC. However, this particular union did result in Augustus's only biological child, a daughter named Julia. Augustus, who was still Octavian at that time, divorced Scribonia the very day that she gave birth to Julia. The grounds were that she had committed adultery, but this may have simply been a convenient excuse, as Octavian had met and fallen for Livia Drusilla at this time. Livia was married herself to Tiberius Claudius Nero, a Roman senator with whom she had 2 children. She quickly obtained a divorce herself, and she and Octavian were wed in 37 BC. They would be happily married for the next 50 years, down to Augustus's death, but the marriage never produced any children, though the reasons are unclear, as both Livia and Augustus had children from their previous marriages. Had Augustus's marriage to Livia resulted in a son, the issue of the succession might have been clearer, though this is by no means certain, as Roman succession practices often involved the adoption of an heir who was considered a worthy successor. From the 20s BC onwards, Augustus considered many possible heirs. Early on, his preference clearly seemed to be for Marcus Agrippa, his most trusted general and ally. Agrippa was periodically placed in charge of affairs in the east of the empire, and Augustus betrothed his daughter Julia to him, a union which resulted in 5 children. However, Agrippa had been born in 63 BC, the same year as Octavian, and he died in 12 BC, long before the emperor. Thereafter, Augustus began grooming his 2 grandchildren from Agrippa and Julia's marriage, Gaius Caesar and Lucius Caesar, as potential heirs. Unfortunately though, the 2 young men both died under relatively mysterious circumstances within 18 months of each other between the autumn of 2 AD and the spring of 4 AD. Suspicions abounded that the Empress Livia had them poisoned to ensure the succession of her surviving son from her first marriage, Tiberius. His route to the imperial titles seemed assured from 6 AD onwards, when Julia and Marcus Agrippa's only living son and Augustus's only surviving biological grandson, Agrippa Posthumus, was banished from the empire for his excessively brutal and violent conduct. In addition to concerns about the succession, the final years of Augustus's reign saw a shifting situation with regard to the empire's borders, or what we might call its foreign policy. As we have seen, the earlier years of Augustus's reign saw the consolidation of the empire's borders in regions such as the Iberian Peninsula, the full conquest of which was finally completed in the early 10s BC. The second half of his reign saw an effort to consolidate the land corridor between the western and eastern parts of the empire in Europe by conquering the regions then known as Pannonia, Illyria, and Moesia, approximating with Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, and parts of Serbia today. In doing so, the empire's territories were extended into an unbroken chain from the Atlantic coast of Iberia all the way eastwards to Thrace in modern-day Turkey. A final revolt known as the Great Illyrian Revolt began here in 6 AD amongst the native tribes, but once this was crushed in 9 AD, all of the Western Balkans was brought firmly under Roman rule. Other consolidations involved acquiring greater control over Armenia in the east to shore up the eastern border, while the Herodian Kingdom of Judea, which had been a client state for decades, was formally annexed, and made into the province of Judea in 6 AD. Thereafter, Augustus began a process of downscaling the military preparedness of the empire and limiting the amount of future conquests which would be undertaken. The one region where Augustus continued to adopt an aggressive foreign policy stance was in Germania. His great-uncle had conquered the vast expanse of Gaul in less than 10 years in the 50s BC, and Augustus was determined to emulate him by extending Roman control eastward over the tribes of Germania, operating out of a major settlement which was being established at Colonia, the Roman town which would eventually grow into the modern city of Cologne. The Roman legions, led by Augustus's great-nephew Germanicus Julius Caesar, began foraying beyond the river Rhine into central and eastern Germany in the late 1st century BC. The advance was so swift at this time that by 7 BC, Roman arms had extended as far as the river Elbe in the east of the region, and a new province called Germania Antiqua was established out of these lands. However, this seemingly comfortable conquest of such a broad expanse of land was too good to be true. In secret, the Germanic tribes of the region were plotting to expel the Romans from their lands, and in 9 AD, when the Roman general Publius Quintilius Varus led 3 legions into the region around Saxony, they were betrayed by a Germanic ally, Arminius, and ambushed. Virtually the entire 3 legions, some 15,000 men, were killed at what has become known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Henceforth, plans to conquer Germania were abandoned, and the River Rhine was established as the northern boundary of the empire. Caesar Augustus died in the year of 14 AD on the 19th of August, a month which was named after him, after July had been named after his great-uncle Julius Caesar. He was nearing his 80th year and was in poor health, and we can probably discount as spurious rumours that Livia poisoned him to speed up the succession of her son Tiberius. It was this stepson of the emperor who would succeed him, not because he had shown himself to be a particularly worthy or accomplished individual, but because he had simply outlasted all of his rivals for the position. Augustus's advice to him prior to his death had been to not expand the empire any further, but instead to secure its existing borders as these made geographic sense, being bounded on the south by the Sahara Desert, on the west and north by the Atlantic Ocean and North Sea, and on the east by the River Rhine and the River Danube in Europe. Although this advice was not precisely followed by Augustus's successors, it was to a sufficient enough extent that it brought peace to the empire for much of the next 2 centuries. This is often referred to as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, under which Rome's 50 to 70 million subjects lived through a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity. It was a far cry from the chaos which characterized the Roman Republic when Octavian was born into it. In the decades which followed, it became clear how difficult Augustus's job as first emperor of Rome had been. His reign was followed by several much poorer ones. His direct successor, Tiberius, is generally understood to have been an aloof, poor ruler who spent years absent from Rome and who relied on unscrupulous middlemen such as the soldier Sejanus to rule on his behalf. He was succeeded by Caligula in 37 BC, a great-grandson of Augustus's, who is generally deemed to have been a mad tyrant and a sexual deviant. When his short reign ended in 41 BC, another member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Tiberius Claudius Caesar, became Emperor Claudius. Although he was generally depicted as a weak ruler by Roman historians, Claudius was actually the most successful of Augustus's near successors, taking an interest in reforming the legal system and initiating a major building program throughout the empire. And the negative depiction of him was most likely on account of his being slightly disabled and having a limp, and thus not being seen as a martial figure who could wage war in the Roman tradition. The last Julio-Claudian emperor, Nero, is typically understood to have been a borderline lunatic who burned down Rome, and whose reign eventually ended in civil war and the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 68 BC. Thus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero, through their failings, did much to highlight exactly how great Augustus's accomplishment had been in bringing stability to the Roman state. Caesar Augustus, the man who became first citizen of Rome, but who began his political ascent as Octavian when he was little more than a boy, is a character who has widely divided opinions in the 2,000 years since he ruled as Rome's first emperor. It could be argued, and has been argued, that he brought the Roman Republic to an end and established a system which destroyed the empire's more democratic institutions. Such a view was articulated by subsequent generations of Roman historians, such as the late 1st century AD senator and writer Tacitus, who claimed that Augustus had subverted the will of the people and made them slaves. In this interpretation, the man who was granted the title of the Illustrious One by the Roman Senate was nothing more than a power-hungry tyrant, the last man left standing after decades of civil war which tore the Republic apart. Moreover, his reign was dominated by warfare, from the near-constant turmoil of the Second Triumvirate to the civil war with Mark Antony, through successive wars in the Middle East and then in Germania. Tens of thousands and quite possibly hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of the conflicts he engaged in or directly initiated. Yet, there is another, completely opposite way of interpreting Augustus. After several decades of internal strife within the Roman Republic, he finally brought the constant civil wars between opposing generals to an end and inaugurated a period of renewed stability. This allowed for the initiation of wide-ranging social reforms and the reorganization of the empire, while the more settled environment in Rome led to the flowering of arguably the greatest period of Roman culture that was seen in its 1,000-year history. Moreover, his foreign policy was practical, insofar as he tried to consolidate Rome's control over the regions it was a major player in already, and then created new borders along easily defensible geographic areas such as the River Rhine in Germania. In doing so, he effectively consolidated the empire after a century and a half of somewhat chaotic expansion since the middle of the 2nd century BC. In doing all of this, he bequeathed to his successors a much more stable situation than Rome faced in the days of Julius Caesar, and when a line of generally competent emperors arrived in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace, stability, and prosperity. But perhaps ultimately he was both of these things simultaneously, both the ruthless and power-hungry man who ended the Roman Republic and made himself ruler of an empire, and the individual who brought stability to a withered republic which was dying long before he consigned it to history. What do you think of Caesar Augustus? Was he a great emperor who finally brought peace to Rome after decades of civil war, or was he a power-hungry tyrant? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Ramesses the Great, known simply as Ramesses in his lifetime, was born in the late 14th century BC. Scholars tend to hold that he was most likely born in the year 1303 BC, but there is no extant information as to his exact date of birth. His father was a member of a leading aristocratic and military family, which hailed from the northern part of Egypt, probably from one of the several fortified urban centers of the Nile River Delta. His original name is unclear, but he would later become known as Seti I, as we will see. Ramesses' mother was Tuya, the daughter of a military officer named Raya, and so a member of the Egyptian military nobility herself. Ramesses was born into a world that had been going through one of the first golden ages of ancient times. This was the height of the Bronze Age, and powerful centralized states had emerged in many parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Greek world was dominated by powers like the Mycenae on the mainland and the Minoans on the island of Crete, and throughout this time, complex literary and artistic societies were beginning to emerge in ways which would shape the ancient world for centuries to come. In what is now Turkey, the powerful Hittite Empire had emerged, centered on the city of Hattusa. Shortly before Ramesses' birth, it had begun conquering parts of the Levant and Mesopotamia, and was effectively Egypt's most significant rival for power in the region. Further to the southeast, a number of significant states existed in Mesopotamia proper and Persia, notably the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. Each of these polities was wealthy, had complex bureaucracies, and was engaged in extensive trade across this Bronze Age world. For instance, a trader or merchant in a city like Tyre or Sidon in the Levant in the 14th century BC could purchase pottery from Knossos in Crete, olive oil from Athens in Greece, papyrus from Egypt, and textiles from Mesopotamia and Persia, all bought and sold in copper, gold, and silver, mined in places like western Anatolia under the Hittites' control, or Cyprus, a major center of copper mining, a necessity in order to make bronze chariots, weapons, and other utensils. Egypt itself was no exception to this story of prosperity. This was an era known as the New Kingdom period, one which had begun in the 16th century BC, and which would extend beyond Ramesses' own time. The term New Kingdom is a relatively modern construct, having been coined in the 19th century, but it is typically accepted by Egyptologists as accurately describing a distinct period of Bronze Age culture in Egypt, which was more prosperous than anything which had preceded it there, even the Old Kingdom culture of the pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids at Giza a millennium earlier. During this New Kingdom period, the pharaohs developed a powerful government overseen by viziers and many scribes. A large military was also kept at the ready, powered by new technologies such as chariots and weapons made of bronze. With all this in train, the pharaohs were not only able to collect a greater amount of taxes and govern more efficiently at home, but the New Kingdom Empire expanded in all directions, with outposts being established further down the River Nile than ever before into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia, and a growing amount of territory being acquired on the Sinai Peninsula and northwards into Canaan and Lebanon. This empire had reached a particular peak in the 15th century BC, during the long reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III, whose conquests extended the Egyptian kingdom northeast into parts of modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. Little is known about the specifics of Ramesses' own childhood, but the political developments of the time were extremely significant. At the time he was born, Egypt was ruled by Pharaoh Horemheb, a member of the 18th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs. Horemheb is known for having restored a certain amount of stability to Egypt's domestic politics after a tumultuous period during which a near predecessor, Akhenaten, had attempted to establish a monotheistic cult of the sun, replacing the traditional religious and political structures of Egypt. This caused enormous unrest within Egypt and led to its decline as an international power. Horemheb reversed many of these decisions and quelled the unrest Akhenaten had created along the course of the River Nile, but he appears to have had no surviving sons and no biological successor. As such, he decided to designate the head of his government, the Grand Vizier Paramesse, as his successor. Paramesse was Ramesses' grandfather, and so the family ascended to become the 19th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs when Paramesse became the pharaoh, adopting the regnal name Ramesses I around 1292 BC. He ruled for just a few short years before his death, at which time Ramesses' father succeeded him as second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, adopting the name Seti I in honor of Seth, the Egyptian god of war. Ramesses was now the heir to the throne of New Kingdom Egypt, as he was soon appointed as Prince Regent by his father, who would reign for just over a decade, during which time he began to re-establish Egyptian control over some of the territory which had been held to the northeast in Canaan and Syria under earlier rulers such as Thutmose III, but which had been lost as a result of the divided state of the kingdom during Akhenaten's reign and religious reforms. Ramesses doubtless accompanied his father in some of his campaigns northeast of the Levant and gained valuable military experience during his time as Prince Regent. He would soon need this experience, as he ascended to the throne as a relatively young man. He is known to have become pharaoh on the 27th day of the season of the harvest in a particular year of his father's reign. one which is believed to equate to an accession date of the 31st of May 1279 BC. He would reign for the next 66 years in what is typically accounted as the most significant reign of any Egyptian pharaoh, adopting the full regnal name Uzema Atres et Dependre, meaning roughly the law or harmony of Ra. The Egyptian sun god is powerful. I am chosen of Ra. Ramesses' first major act as the new ruler of Egypt was to deal with a threat which had been growing in the northern parts of the kingdom for several years. Even before his accession, sea pirates known as the Ushered sea pirates had been raiding the northern coast of the kingdom into the River Nile Delta from the eastern Mediterranean. This was one of the most prosperous and important parts of Ramesses' kingdom, and it was vital that these encroachments be stopped. Thus, beginning in the second year of his reign, he began establishing forts along the northern coast of the kingdom and northeastwards towards Sinai and Canaan. New ships were also constructed to patrol the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, and warning posts were set up to signal to larger settlements when raiding parties were making their way towards the Egyptian kingdom. All of this culminated in a major sea battle, in which Ramesses and his navy were victorious. A stele or memorial stone commemorating this at Tanis in the northeast of the Nile Delta has survived down to modern times and provides evidence of this victory today, but the exact details of how it occurred or what it involved, other than that Ramesses scored an early victory, remain unclear. Having stabilized the northern shores of Egypt and the Nile Delta, Ramesses' primary aim became to restore Egyptian control over Canaan and other parts of the Levant as had existed in earlier times. This was a paramount concern. While Egypt itself was an affluent land based on the bounteous agriculture practiced along the shores of the River Nile and the production of pottery and papyrus in cities like Thebes and Memphis, the most affluent cities in the late Bronze Age world lay in Canaan, cities like Tyre and Sidon, which were at the crossroads of all the major empires and were major trading centers as a result. Consequently, Ramesses was anxious to restore Egyptian rule over the region, as had existed 2 centuries earlier in the time of Thutmose III. However, while there was no state with an army sufficient to withstand Egypt within Canaan and the southern reaches of the Levant, the region was also coveted by the Hittite Empire to the north. Much of Ramesses' rule would be concerned with trying to seize control of this region and stave off counterattacks by the Hittites. In the course of doing so, he would fight arguably the most significant battle in the history of the Bronze Age. One of Ramesses' first actions early in his reign was to construct a new capital in the northeastern parts of the Nile Delta, in an effort to increase Egyptian power to the northeast into the Levant. The capital of pharaonic Egypt had moved around over the centuries. For instance, in ancient times during the Old Kingdom period, it lay at Memphis, near what is now Cairo. However, the capital during the New Kingdom period was typically located well down the River Nile, at what was known then as Thebes, but which we call Luxor today. Akhenaten, the controversial pharaoh who, a half-century before Ramesses' birth, had attempted to establish a monotheistic religion centered on the worship of Aten, had established a new capital at Amarna as a center of the new religion. Thus, there was a substantial precedent for moving the capital of the pharaonic kingdom. Ramesses named his new capital Piramses, near what is now the town of Qantir. Ramesses' father, Seti I, had previously had a summer palace in the region, and it seems likely that Ramesses had spent much of his youth here. Now, in the 1270s, he established it as a quasi-military capital with large workshops and factories erected to begin churning out significant quantities of weapons, armor, and chariots. As such, Piramses became a kind of administrative capital of Lower Egypt, but as we will see from Ramesses' building program, he never abandoned the belief that Thebes or Luxor was the religious and spiritual capital of Egypt. In the earliest part of his wars against the Hittites, Ramesses faced King Muwatalli II, the ruler of the Hittite Empire, since the mid-1290s. This Muwatalli had taken advantage of Egyptian weakness early in his reign and moved his capital south from the traditional site at Hattusa, in what is now central Turkey, to Tarhuntusa, in the southeast of the Konya Plain. It was indicative of how both rulers saw Canaan, Syria, and the wider Levant as a contested region, which they needed to be near, that both Ramesses and Muwatalli moved their capitals to be closer to the Levant. In the earliest years of his reign, Ramesses conducted annual military campaigns northeast from the Nile Delta. The first of these, around 1275 BC, resulted in the pharaoh cementing his control over southern Canaan, before campaigning further north to the region around modern-day Beirut. Here he had a commemorative stele, or pylon, erected at Nar el-Kalb. The text of this has been obliterated over time, but it almost certainly proclaimed Ramesses' successes in campaigning this far north, a statement of Egypt's claims to control the region. Similarly, he engaged in further campaigns against the Amuru, a people who occupied much of what is now Syria as vassals of King Muwatalli and the Hittites. However, whatever nominal control over this region Ramesses was able to establish in 1275 was ephemeral. No sooner had he withdrawn back to Pyrameses at the end of the campaigning season than Egyptian influence in Syria effectively collapsed, and the Hittites were able to reimpose themselves. The war between the Egyptians and the Hittites at this time has become widely renowned for a battle which it is generally accepted occurred in the year 1274 BC. This was the Battle of Kadesh, or Kadesh, near the city of Kadesh on the banks of the Orontes River in western Syria. The Battle of Kadesh was clearly a highly significant one, involving armies of a very substantial size by the standards of the Late Bronze Age, but also being regarded as a unique or significant event by the parties involved. It is, for instance, the best documented military encounter of the second millennium BC, with both sides making extensive records concerning it in years to come in the form of tablets, wall paintings, and inscriptions throughout Egypt and other parts of the Late Bronze Age world. Thus, the Battle of Kadesh was unquestionably believed by contemporaries to have been an era-defining military engagement. The background of the battle was Ramesses' new campaign into Syria in 1274 BC. As with the previous year's campaign, his goal was to extend Egyptian power further north into Syria at the expense of the Hittites. Ramesses led 4 divisions of troops into Canaan and then north towards Syria that year. These were named for some of the paramount Egyptian deities, Amun, Ra, Seth, and Ptah, and consisted of perhaps as many as 40,000 men, with 2,000 chariots also provided for the campaign. These were augmented by thousands of Canaanite mercenaries who joined the pharaoh's forces. However, not all of these forces were deployed at Kadesh, and it seems probable that Ramesses' forces did not exceed 30,000 men in total on the field of battle. Arrayed against him was Muwatalli's army of somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 men, with several thousand chariots also brought south into Syria. Consequently, the armies of the two sides were relatively evenly matched. A striking aspect of the engagement was the number of chariots deployed, with many Egyptologists and Hittite scholars speculating since that this was the largest chariot battle in history. In its initial stages, Ramesses was caught off guard at Kadesh. He received false intelligence about the location of the main Hittite army far to the north, whereas in fact Muwatalli's armies were stationed near Old Kadesh, not far from the Egyptian advance party. As a result, when the Hittites attacked, some of Ramesses' main divisions of troops were far to the south and could not be brought into the field of battle. As a result, the Ra division was scattered by a Hittite chariot assault in the first stages of the battle near Kadesh. However, this is the point at which Ramesses' leadership is believed to have proved pivotal, as he steeled the Ammon division of his troops and counterattacked against the Hittites, breaking their chariot assault. Some accounts have it that the fault also lay with the Hittites, who, believing that their initial attack had proved conclusive, had stopped to plunder the baggage trains and goods of the Ra division. leaving them exposed to Ramesses' coordinated counterattack. Thereafter, Muwatalli ordered his troops to retreat towards the Orontes River. Later Egyptian accounts suggest that the Ptah division now arrived to Kadesh and harried the Hittites. Muwatalli ordered a new counterattack led by his chariot divisions, but this was unable to break the Egyptian advance. Eventually, the Hittites were forced to flee northwards over the river Orontes, in many cases throwing their weapons and armor aside in order to swim through the river to safety. It is unclear exactly how conclusive the alleged Egyptian victory at Kadesh was. Some Egyptologists believe that the battle was a major military victory for Ramesses. He certainly depicted it as such. For the rest of his long reign, the pharaoh consistently erected stelae and had inscriptions and wall paintings placed in temples and in his palaces, depicting Kadesh as a great victory for Egypt in Syria. These include the Kadesh inscriptions or bulletin and the poem of Pentor, a prose account of the Egyptian victory which is repeated on the walls of temples all along the course of the River Nile. The poem is extant in 8 different places, while the bulletin is to be found inscribed in 7 different locations around Egypt. Consequently, it is clearly something which Ramesses tried to establish as the official version of his alleged victory at Kadesh. But other scholars of the late Bronze Age world are more skeptical, with some arguing that Kadesh was probably more of a stalemate than a victory for either side. Certainly, it cannot have been the kind of comprehensive victory which Ramesses attempted to depict it as, for the battle did not lead to any major shift in the strategic situation in Syria. Rather, the Egyptians and the Hittites continued to contest the region for many years to come. The Battle of Kadesh did not bring the war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire to a complete conclusion, though it did signal the end of the most intense initial period of clashes between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Skirmishes continued for years thereafter. For instance, in 1269 BC, Ramesses launched a new campaign into Syria, during which he conquered the city of Dapur. However, the pattern during the 1260s was that Ramesses was able to briefly acquire control over parts of Syria while he campaigned personally there. But longer-term control over the region could not be maintained once the major Egyptian military presence was withdrawn. In recognition of this situation around 1259 BC, the Egyptians and the Hittites agreed to what is variously called either the Egyptian-Hittite Treaty or the Eternal Treaty or Silver Treaty. This was signed between Ramesses II and Hutusili III, who had succeeded as ruler of the Hittite Empire at some point in the 1260s. The Eternal Treaty effectively brokered a lasting peace, one in which the two powers agreed to cease hostilities as it was costing both governments exorbitant amounts of money and achieving little for either. Thus, Syria was to become a sphere of Hittite influence, with Egypt largely confirmed in its control of Canaan and other more southerly parts of the Levant. Bonds were agreed and pledges made, and the gods invoked as overseers of the eternal peace. The Eternal Treaty is one of the most famed international agreements made in ancient times. This is owing to the highly unusual survival of multiple copies of the text over 3 millennia later in different languages. Copies of the text of the treaty in Egyptian hieroglyphics were found inscribed in 2 separate locations in Luxor in central Egypt in the first half of the 19th century. Then, in the first years of the 20th century, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler uncovered a copy of the text in the Akkadian language, the lingua franca of the Hittite Empire and other states of the Middle East in the 13th century BC, as part of a cache of approximately 10,000 tablets which were discovered while excavating the ancient Hittite capital at Hattusa in Turkey. Thus, we have a remarkable example here of an international treaty being copied out and deposited in royal archives and temples in cities 2,000 kilometers away from each other over 3,200 years ago. As to the motives of the respective parties, it is clear that both Ramesses and Hutusili had both come to believe that peace and the fostering of trade in the Levant would be more beneficial than a continuation of their rivalry. while both states were quite likely wary of the rise of the Assyrian Empire to the east in Mesopotamia and believed a united front against this upstart power was better than ongoing warfare in Syria. The signing of the Eternal Treaty also provided a respite for Ramesses in order for him to concentrate militarily on matters to the south of Egypt. For roughly a millennium between the middle of the 3rd millennium BC down to roughly 1500 BC, the region of modern-day Sudan had been independent of Egypt. At the time it was known as Nubia and was dominated by the Kerema culture, which produced states like the Kingdom of Kush. However, during the New Kingdom period, and in particular during the reign of Thutmose III, Nubia had gradually been brought more and more under the control of pharaonic Egypt. As with Canaan and Syria, Egyptian control declined here as a result of the unrest created by Akhenaten's rule in the 14th century BC. But Ramesses was now in a position to reverse this situation. Early in his reign, he had already campaigned south of the first cataract of the Nile. These cataracts are a series of locations along the course of the River Nile where the whitewater rapids predominate, and were used at the time as intermediary points where Egyptian arms were extended as far as was possible in campaigns against the Nubians. By the 1260s, Ramesses had effectively extended Egyptian control as far as the Second Cataract, which lies south of Abu Simbel and Wadi Halfa in what is now northern Sudan. But the period following the establishment of the Eternal Treaty with the Hittites provided a military respite which allowed Ramesses to send forces further south again to the Third Cataract. This lies well into Sudan at the northern margin of the Dongola River. Here, Ramesses was able to establish a southern military colony at Tombos, as evidenced by the discovery of pharaonic and royal inscriptions here in tombs built at the height of the New Kingdom in the 13th century BC. Thus, by the 1240s BC, Ramesses had effectively brought a significant amount of Nubia under outright Egyptian control. Ramesses was soon campaigning westwards as well. Our knowledge of Libya in ancient times is surprisingly limited for a region which was in close proximity to major centers of civilization such as Egypt and Crete. Generally speaking, the main settlement points here were a series of ports and oases along the north coast or slightly inland, but proximate to the Mediterranean Sea. The land here was known as Jehenu to the Egyptians. Libya is a name derived from later Greek descriptions of the region. Despite the lack of historical knowledge about the society that existed here in ancient times, there was significant contact between the Egyptians and Libya throughout the New Kingdom period, mostly in the form of Berber raids into the western branches of the Nile Delta and Egyptian efforts to establish coastal colonies along the north of Libya. Ramesses attempted to further this effort by establishing new forts along the Mediterranean coastline and reinforcing a fort at Zawiat el-Rakam, which his father, Seti I, had established earlier after campaigning against the Libyan tribes of the region. In the course of Ramesses' reign, this became the major western extremity of the Egyptian kingdom, though trade centers and vassal states were to be found further to the west in Libya proper. These accomplishments, as with nearly everything else to do with Ramesses' military endeavors, were recorded in a series of stelae and other monumental inscriptions in southern and central Egypt later in his reign. With these campaigns in Nubia and Libya, and the earlier endeavors in Canaan and Syria, by the middle of his reign, Ramesses had succeeded in extending the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had been at since the days of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier. Beyond the pharaoh's core control of Egypt, his forces had moved south along the River Nile, effectively repossessing Nubia after it had broadly regained its independence during the period of instability under Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. Elsewhere, Ramesses had campaigned westwards into the deserts of the Sahara and along the north coast to bring Libya into a partial vassalage. However, it was his conquests to the northeast that were most substantial. Here, Ramesses had captured Canaan and much of Syria, It wasn't simply that this was one of the richest parts of the world at the time, with affluent trading cities like Tyre and Sidon, but in order to achieve some hegemony here, Ramesses had to defeat one of the most substantial powers of the ancient world, the Hittite Empire. In doing so, he carved out one of the largest territorial empires ever seen up to that time. Thus, in the late Bronze Age, Ramesses had arguably transformed New Kingdom Egypt into the most powerful state in the known world, a major achievement after the period of instability that had characterized Egypt as recently as the 14th century. Throughout his military campaigns of the 1270s, 1260s and 1250s, Ramesses was accompanied by an ever-growing number of his sons. This is unsurprising when we consider that Ramesses is believed to have had approximately 100 children, of which a roughly equal amount were sons and daughters. Such a large brood was a byproduct of the practice of polygamy by ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Ramesses had many wives, the details of several of which are well known. For instance, his primary consort was Nefertari, the first of Ramesses' great royal wives. Her background is not precisely known, but some have speculated that she was descended from Pharaoh I, who had ruled Egypt 4 decades prior to Ramesses' succession as part of the 18th dynasty. She and Ramesses evidently married quite young, as she became queen consort as soon as he ascended to the throne around 1279 BC. They had many children together, and on the strength of the numerous temples and shrines which Ramesses had built in her honor, there is no doubting that she was the most revered of his wives. She is also somewhat unique as a queen consort of the New Kingdom period, for whom we have extant correspondence. Nefertari wrote on multiple occasions to King Hattusili III, ruler of the Hittite Empire, and his wife Puduhepa in the 1260s and 1250s, and tablets of this correspondence have been unearthed in the Hittite capital Hattusa. Nefertari died around 1255, and since Ramesses lived for many decades to come, new great wives emerged in the years that followed. Paramount amongst these was Isetnofret. She too seems to have married Ramesses before his accession as pharaoh, but she was clearly a junior consort while Nefertari lived. Her seniority from the mid-1250s is attested to by numerous inscriptions and records of her which appear on statues and temple walls across Egypt. Other great wives of the pharaoh emerged from political arrangements. For instance, as part of the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC with the Hittites, Ramesses took one of the daughters of King Hattusili III and Queen Puduhepa as his wife, although the marriage to Matornofurere was not solemnized until the mid-1240s BC, presumably as the Hittite king's daughter was considered to be too young for the marriage to be formalized in the early 1250s BC. Curiously enough, some of Ramesses' other great royal wives included some of his daughters. Bint Anat, for instance, was born from Ramesses' marriage to Isetnofret, before later marrying her own father. Such familial relationships were common throughout the history of pharaonic Egypt and resulted in significant complications of inbreeding, the most famous example of which had been Tutankhamun 50 years before Ramesses' reign. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple physical ailments, the exact nature of which are still debated, but which Egyptologists concur were most likely owing to the species of inbreeding that characterized Ramesses II's own familial life in the 13th century BC. This extensive royal family was intimately connected throughout Ramesses' long reign with the cult of Ra, the sun god, and one of the paramount deities in the Egyptian religious system, who was also worshipped as Amun-Ra in a slightly different form. Ra, along with others such as Ptah and Horus, were the paramount deities of the New Kingdom, and as we will see shortly, Ramesses' extensive building program across Egypt from the 1260s onwards made continuous efforts to associate the pharaoh with the cult of these particular deities. From the early 1240s BC onwards, once Ramesses had reigned over 30 years, he was also able to become the center of his own species of religious cult in the shape of the Sed festival or Feast of the Tail. This was a religious festival which was held annually to celebrate the reign of any pharaoh who had ruled for over 30 years. It was nominally held in honor of the wolf god, Sed or Wepwawet. The origins of the festival are somewhat macabre. It may have been the case that the Sed festival was originally held as a ritual in which a long-lived pharaoh was ritually murdered, the idea being that once he reached a certain age, it was time for him to be removed from power. Over time, the festival changed to one in which the king was honored rather than killed. Under Ramesses, the Sed festival was celebrated at the traditional capital, Thebes, for the first time in 1249 BC. Thereafter, it was held every 3 years for as long as Ramesses lived. Such was the length of his reign that he went on to celebrate an unprecedented number of Sed festivals. If the first half of Ramesses' reign was primarily dominated by warfare and the extension of the realm's borders, the second half of it was remarkable for the extensive building projects which were undertaken by the pharaoh. Ancient Egypt is synonymous with brilliant architectural achievement, but this was achieved at irregular intervals. For instance, the first intermediate period of Egyptian history, which occurred in the late 3rd millennium BC, prior to the advent of the subsequent Middle Kingdom, was a period of lackluster building projects. Conversely, the New Kingdom period, which had begun in the 16th century BC, saw a new age of major building projects commissioned by the pharaohs along the River Nile. Ramesses II was the greatest proponent of this new age of pharaonic patronage of religious and mortuary architecture. In fact, his reign witnessed the most significant building program seen since the days of pharaohs such as Cheops, who in the 26th century BC constructed the pyramid complex at Giza near modern-day Cairo, including the Great Pyramids, the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. However, by the New Kingdom period, such monumental buildings as were constructed by Ramesses focused more on erecting great temples, obelisks, and statues to honor the pharaoh and the gods, rather than on giant pyramids to act as mortuary tombs. One of the most significant building projects undertaken by Ramesses was at Thebes or Luxor in central Egypt, the traditional capital of New Kingdom Egypt. Here Ramesses had the Ramesseum built on the Theban necropolis, an elevated region on the west bank of the River Nile in the city where many other pharaohs had erected mortuary and religious buildings over the centuries. The Ramesseum took roughly 20 years to complete and is effectively a temple with several courtyards surrounding it. Large stone pylons and gateways lead from courtyard to courtyard, with a gigantic statue of Ramesses towering over the inner court. The temple itself consisted of 3 rooms with columns and terrace-style cells dividing up the sanctuary. Throughout them stand many statues of the Egyptian gods and goddesses, while several colossal statues of Ramesses once adorned the temple. Unfortunately, several of these were removed from Thebes in the 19th century and are now found in places in Europe such as the British Museum. On what remains, reliefs commemorate Ramesses' victory at Kadesh and other accomplishments both inside and outside the temple. What is particularly interesting about the Ramesseum is that there is evidence that a scribal school was also established here, while a small royal palace stood next to the courtyard, indicating that this was a site with several other uses beyond its religious functions. It clearly served as a center of pharaonic government in Thebes when Ramesses based himself out of the traditional New Kingdom capital. Ramesses also ordered some construction work at Saqqara. This is a site not far from the Great Pyramids of Giza and where the first major pyramid ever built in ancient Egypt, that of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, was built in the 27th century BC. And Saqqara remained a major center of monumental building work over the centuries. Ramesses decided to make his own contributions to the complexes here, in association with one of his eldest sons, Prince Kha-Emweset. For instance, the pair had the Pyramid of Unas, a pharaoh of the 5th dynasty who had lived in the 24th century BC, repaired and added an inscription to the southern facade of the edifice to indicate that they had overseen this restoration work. Ramesses and his son also enlarged the temple of Serapis or Serapeum at Saqqara, a major center of the cult of Apis, the bull god of Egyptian mythology, who is believed to be the physical manifestation of Ptah, the Egyptian god of crafts, merchants, and the dead. Recent archaeological discoveries at Saqqara have also unearthed the tomb of Ptah Mwea, who served for a time as Grand Vizier and treasurer in the government of Ramesses II. His was not the only tomb built at Saqqara for senior government officials of Ramesses' reign, and the site at Saqqara highlights the esteem such bureaucrats were held in at the height of the new kingdom in ancient Egypt. One of the most significant aspects of Ramesses' building program was the manner in which he used grand temples and buildings as a way of expressing the extension of Egyptian power into regions which had largely become independent of pharaonic rule in the 14th century BC. This was particularly the case to the south towards Nubia, along the course of the River Nile. Ramesses had many temples constructed here on the way to what is now Sudan, as an expression of the rejuvenation of Egyptian rule here. One of the most impressive was the Temple of Beit al-Wali, which was built on an island in the middle of the River Nile, just a few kilometers from Aswan in southern Egypt. This was dedicated to some of the foremost Egyptian deities of the New Kingdom period, Amun-Ra, Re-Horakti, Khnum, and Anuket. It is notable for having some of the best preserved and most impressive wall painting reliefs from ancient Egypt, many of which depict Ramesses' campaigns into Nubia and his subjugation of the region. His campaigns into Syria and Libya are also depicted. Over 100 kilometers to the south, on the west bank of the River Nile, Ramesses had the two temples of Wadi es-Sabur also constructed, renovating one earlier temple in the process. The site here was used as a stop-off point for boats traversing the Nile to and from Nubia. Ramesses thus had the temples constructed in a location where many people visited and dedicated them both to himself and Amun-Ra. Perhaps the most striking architectural feature here are rows of sphinxes which depicted Ramesses as individuals entered and left the temples. Perhaps the greatest building project undertaken by Ramesses, though, lay far to the south of Luxor near what is now the border between Egypt and Sudan at the Second Nile Cataract. This was the temple complex near what was then known as Ipsambul, but which we know today as Abu Simbel. Here Ramesses had initiated the construction of two temples back in the mid-1260s. They would take 20 years to complete, but eventually resulted in two large temples carved in a sheer rock face near the village. One of these was dedicated to Ramesses himself, and the smaller one was in honor of the pharaoh's primary consort, Queen Nefertari. When it was completed in 1244 BC, the great temple was inscribed as having been built as, quote, the Temple of Ramesses, beloved of Amun. It consisted of a grand entrance which led into a temple dedicated to several of the major Egyptian deities. Sculptures and reliefs adorned the interior. It is also believed that the temple was built in such a way that the chamber flooded with sunlight on the 22nd of October and the 22nd of February every year, illuminating the statues here. It is speculated that these dates are significant as possibly being the dates of Ramesses' birth and coronation as pharaoh. Moreover, the reliefs and sculptures are celebratory of Ramesses' reign, with his military campaigns and his victories depicted on the walls, notably the Battle of Kadesh. While the interior of the Temple of Abu Simbel is impressive, the most notable aspect of the temple complex is the series of colossal statues which were erected on either side of the main entrance outside the temple. At the Grand Temple, there are 4 such colossal statues, 2 to either side of the entrance. All 4 of these depict Ramesses and stand approximately 20 meters tall, making them some of the largest pharaonic statues ever carved during the 3 millennia of ancient Egyptian history. It is difficult to get a precise idea of how vast these statues are from looking at photographs, but if one stands next to them, an individual only reaches up to the pharaoh's feet, with the remainder of the statues towering well above. On each statue, Ramesses was depicted wearing the dual crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. A statement here in the border region between Egypt and Nubia that the pharaoh was lord of the land of the river Nile, both to the south and the north. Thus, the temple of Abu Simbel was meant as a statement of Ramesses' power and rule over Egypt, a proclamation of sorts to those south of Abu Simbel that the pharaohs reigned here yet again. Abu Simbel is the pinnacle of Ramesses' building program. Ramesses' reign is notable for its length. Having most likely succeeded his father in 1279 BC, he is believed to have ruled for over 65 years. However, what is somewhat unusual about this long reign is how unremarkable the second half of it was, and in particular, the last 2 decades or so of Ramesses' reign. All of the notable events of his time as pharaoh, from the Battle of Kadesh to the Eternal Treaty and the campaigns west to Libya and south into Nubia, all occurred in the first 20 or so years of his rule. Even the monumental building programs which he undertook at Abu Simbel, Thebes and elsewhere, although many of them took upwards of 20 years to complete, were generally finished by the early 1230s BC. By way of comparison, the last 20 or so years of Ramesses II's reign are something of a mystery. There is little evidence of major events or what he may have been doing. This is quite possibly because the pharaoh spent many years ill towards the end of his life, and with his health declining. Scientific analysis of his mummy in recent times has revealed that Ramesses suffered from a range of ailments in old age, including arthritis, atherosclerosis, and severe dental issues, but he survived for an immense amount of time despite these illnesses. Such evidence as we have indicates Ramesses II did not die until 1213 BC in the 66th year of his reign, probably aged around 90, an extraordinarily long life by the standards of the time. He was originally interred in the Valley of the Kings, where many pharaohs were interred in the hills outside Thebes, but owing to looting of the graves here, his body was moved on several occasions. Like all the ancient pharaohs, he was mummified, meaning that his body was partially preserved across the centuries. Ramesses was succeeded by his son Merneptah, who took the regnal name Ba-en-re-Merinetjeru, which means the soul of Ra, beloved of the gods. This Merneptah is believed to have been the 13th son of Ramesses, a development which should have placed him well down the pecking order of possible successors to his father. However, Ramesses had lived for so long that a huge number of his oldest sons had died. Indeed, Merneptah was probably well into his 60s by the time of his own accession, and his reign would only last 10 years. The most significant development during his reign was a victory which he won over the tribes of Libya at the Battle of Perire in 1208 BC. Thereafter, there was a quick succession of pharaohs before the 19th dynasty came to an end, with the dying out of Ramesses' direct line of descent in 1189 BC. Thus, the dynasty lasted for just over a century and was completely dominated by the reign of Ramesses II. However, in recognition of the extraordinary reign of Ramesses the Great, many pharaohs of the 20th dynasty adopted his regnal name. In all, there were eventually 11 Ramesses, the last being Ramesses XI of the 20th dynasty, who died around 1077 BC. In death, Ramesses II has acquired an even greater historical fame over the years, as it has been regularly speculated that he is the pharaoh of the story of the Book of Exodus in the Old Testament. This is one of the earliest sections of the Old Testament, and is central to both Judaism and Christianity. In it, the story of the Jews, who are effectively living as slaves in what is termed the land of Goshen, but which is pharaonic Egypt, is related. This picks up from the book of Genesis, which had related how Joseph, the son of the Hebrew prophet Jacob, had been tricked by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Over the next several generations, a large community of Jewish slaves came to live in Egypt under the subjugation of the Egyptian pharaohs. In Exodus, we read the story of how the Jewish prophet Moses is placed in a reed basket and sent down the river Nile by his mother Jochebed. after the pharaoh had ordered the murder of Jewish children following concern about the number of Jews or Israelites that were then present in Egypt. Moses is subsequently found and adopted into the pharaoh's household, where he gains the affection of the Egyptian king. But Moses clashes with the pharaoh's biological son. Eventually, he realizes he is one of the Israelites and leads his people out of Egypt by parting the Red Sea as the pharaoh's forces attempt to chase him. The debate on Ramesses is whether he could be identified as being either the ruling pharaoh of the Book of Exodus or his biological son who becomes Moses' rival. There is really no substantive case, however, in either instance for speculating to this effect. The Book of Exodus makes no effort to identify the historical figures who might have been involved in pharaonic Egypt at the time, and the historicity of the events of the Old Testament are, of course, open to speculation as well. Consequently, different writers have speculated that a wide range of pharaohs dating from as early as the 17th century BC and as late as the 12th century BC may be the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus or his biological son. An unusually high proportion of people have been anxious to suggest it was Ramesses II who was the pharaoh at the time, with this line being favored in more than one prominent Hollywood treatment of Moses' life, notably the Ten Commandments of 1956, in which Ramesses was depicted by Yul Brynner. These depictions are largely due to Ramesses being the most prominent pharaoh of this age. His reign was lengthy, and he was involved in military conquests in the Levant, which would fit with oppression of the Israelites. These things aside, though, there is no historical basis for suggesting that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus. Indeed, that Ramesses should be identified with the biblical pharaoh of Exodus is perhaps fitting. After all, much of the tale of Moses portends doom for Egypt for impeding the destiny of the Israelites to return to their ancestral homeland and establish a new kingdom there. And there is no doubting that New Kingdom Egypt quickly headed towards a period of immense decline shortly after Ramesses' reign. Beginning around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and adjoining areas were struck by a series of attacks by a mysterious confederation of warlike people who have typically been identified as the Sea Peoples. There is no consensus even today as to who these people were or where they had come from, although it has plausibly been speculated that they came eastwards from the western Mediterranean, possibly from Italy and parts of southern France or the northwestern Balkans. Wherever they came from, what we do know is that the onslaught of these newcomers, along with the arrival of other warlike peoples such as the Dorians who came from northern Greece around this time, was an immediate threat to the late Bronze Age world and began to destabilize societies such as those of New Kingdom Egypt in the decades that followed. What followed is typically referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse in the historiography of the ancient world, as the powerful states which had dominated the region for several centuries either declined dramatically or collapsed. The Hittite Empire splintered into several smaller states during the course of the 12th century BC, while Bronze Age Mycenae and the Minoan civilization of Crete were almost entirely destroyed. New Kingdom Egypt also entered a period of pronounced decline, though it survived as a substantial polity, albeit much weakened internally, divided by civil wars and reduced in terms of its territorial expanse. This reflected much of what occurred elsewhere. Trade collapsed across the Bronze Age world for the space of 2 centuries or more, and the economy was so impacted that whole cities were abandoned, and famines struck many regions, such that many historians of the ancient past refer to this as being a dark age of the ancient world, similar to what followed the collapse of the Roman Empire nearly 2 millennia later. What is known as the Third Intermediate Period of Egyptian history followed the end of the New Kingdom, as new regional powers began to dominate what remained of pharaonic Egypt, some of them hailing from Nubia in the south. Ramesses II's tomb was discovered during the late 19th century. This was a time when Egyptology, the study of pharaonic Egypt, was entering its first golden age following the deciphering of Egyptian hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone. The great pharaoh's tomb was discovered at Deir al-Bahari in 1881 near Thebes, within a wider cache of royal tombs dating to the New Kingdom period. Ramesses' tomb, like nearly all other pharaohs, had been looted at some stage in the past and revealed nothing to rival the riches of that of Tutankhamun, which would be discovered 40 years later by Howard Carter. However, Ramesses' tomb is nevertheless significant, particularly a series of inscriptions on the sarcophagus which listed Ramesses' various names and titles and also provided an inventory of his burial goods. The inscriptions also indicate that Ramesses was not immediately interred at Deir al-Bahari, but rather he was first laid to rest in the tomb of his father, Seti I. It remained there for the next 80 years, until such time in the mid-12th century that his tomb was relocated. What is especially strange about all of this is that Egyptologists now believe that the wooden and painted death mask and sarcophagus used in Ramesses' new tomb were actually recycled from the tomb of one of his near successors, Horemheb, the last ruler of the 18th dynasty. It is also evident that renovations were carried out on Ramesses' tomb in subsequent years, indicating that the ancient Egyptians did not simply seal the tombs of dead pharaohs for all time when they were laid to rest, but viewed some of these tombs as shrines, which were to be maintained and improved where possible. Unsurprisingly, given the extent of the building program he oversaw, Ramesses II has continued to feature regularly in studies of ancient Egypt and new archaeological projects. Indeed, in the case of Abu Simbel, his temple here was central to one of the most extraordinary relocation projects ever undertaken. In the 1950s, the new government of General Abdel Nasser, who had seized power in Egypt following the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, determined to build a vast new dam at Aswan in order to henceforth control the annual flooding or inundation of the River Nile, on which so much of the country's agriculture depended. The resulting flooding and the creation of what was to be named Lake Nasser near the dam would have submerged Abu Simbel. Accordingly, in 1959, the Egyptian government applied to UNESCO to move the temple. This petition was granted, and over the next several years, several Swedish engineering firms undertook the project for the Egyptian government. The work involved was highly complex, as Abu Simbel was not constructed out of blocks of stone, but was carved into a cliff face. Thus, the temple was rescued by effectively making a giant incision into the mountainside and then transplanting the temple piece by piece to a site several hundred meters inland and much higher above ground. Thus, Abu Simbel now overlooks the River Nile, much as it has for over 3 millennia, but from a different vantage point and site. Owing to the length of his reign and its significance, Ramesses has also featured extensively in modern popular culture. For instance, Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings, published in 1983 by the American author, was an enormous fictional account of pharaonic Egypt set on one evening in the late 12th century BC, but in which the characters repeatedly discuss the reign of Ramesses II. The Battle of Kadesh is a major feature of the work. Ramesses was also the subject of works by the noted historical fiction writer Christian Jack, while he is the central character too of Anne Rice's The Mummy. So too does he appear in many numerous Hollywood treatments of ancient Egypt. But surely the most notable popular cultural reference to the victor of the Battle of Kadesh appeared 2 centuries ago in the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, the Greek name for Ramesses. Here, Shelley used Ramesses as an example of how all great rulers are destined for decline or death. It was meant to be a reflection by Shelley primarily on Napoleon Bonaparte, who had fallen from power in France and Europe just a few years before Shelley's time of writing. But Shelley used Ramesses as his analogy, as news was circulating around London at the time that the British Museum had just acquired one of the colossal heads of the pharaoh from the Ramesseum. Shelley's repetition of the inscription which once adorned the tomb, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings," "Look on my works, ye mighty," and "Despair" must rank as amongst some of the most famous lines of 19th century poetry. Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, was arguably the greatest of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs, of which there were over 170 across 3 millennia. His reign is notable for many things. From a political and military perspective, he extended the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had seen since the reign of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier, the point at which Egypt reached its greatest extremity by conquering much of the Levant, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. Ramesses did this primarily by defeating the Hittites in his nation's ongoing struggle with them for hegemony over the rich coastal cities of Canaan and Syria such as Tyre and Sidon. The peak of his success in this respect was victory at the Battle of Kadesh and the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC. But it was not just here where Ramesses was militarily successful. He also campaigned against the ushered sea pirates early on in his reign, which had been plaguing the northern coast of Egypt for many years prior to his accession, and later campaigned westwards along the Mediterranean coast towards Libya. Finally, to the south, he extended the Egyptian kingdom's influence much further down the course of the River Nile into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia. This new kingdom empire of Ramesses II was one of the most formidable empires of ancient times. However, there is also the distinct possibility that Ramesses has been accorded the prominence which he has in studies of ancient Egypt and amongst Egyptologists owing to his own self-promotion. Ramesses was one of history's first great propagandists. There was no success which he achieved on the battlefield or aspect of his reign that he did not commemorate in stone in such a way as it would be remembered for centuries or even millennia to come. Thus, for instance, we find him setting stone stelae and other markers in the Nile Delta and the Levant to proclaim his victories over the Hittites and the ushered sea pirates there to the world and to future generations. But it was his building program in places like Luxor, Saqqara, and above all Abu Simbel, way down the Nile near Aswan, which afforded him his greatest legacy. Here in stone he proclaimed to all his magnificence as a ruler, his ties to the sun god Ra, and his many military accomplishments. Yet while these building works may have been acts of propaganda, there is no denying their brilliance. Accordingly, from the perspective of the 21st century, surely Ramesses' greatest accomplishment was in having these magnificent temples, statues, and obelisks erected across Egypt nearly 3,500 years ago. What do you think of Ramesses the Great? Was he ancient Egypt's greatest pharaoh? Or is the greatness of his legacy partly due to a shrewd policy of propaganda concerning his building projects, as well as his promotion of his own military victories? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as King Leonidas I of Sparta was born around 540 BC in the Greek city-state which he would one day rule. His father was Anaxandridas II, the 15th king of the Achaemenid line, who ruled Sparta for nearly 40 years between around 560 BC and 520 BC. Together with his co-king Ariston, Anaxandridas ruled Sparta during a time when it cemented its position as the most powerful city-state in the Greek world. The name of Leonidas's mother is unknown, but according to the near-contemporary Greek historian Herodotus, she was the niece of her husband Anaxandridas. After several years of marriage, she had not produced an heir, prompting the powerful Council of Ephors, the most powerful magistrates in Sparta next to the kings, to demand that Anaxandridas divorce her and marry a woman who could bear children. When Anaxandridas refused to do so, the Ephors allowed him to take a second wife while remaining married to his first. The king's new wife soon gave him his first son, a boy named Cleomenes. After he obtained his desired heir by his second wife, Anaxandridas returned to his first wife, who then surprisingly gave birth to 3 sons in quick succession: Dorius, Leonidas, and Cleombrotus. Leonidas was born into the Aegeid dynasty, the senior of the 2 lines of kings who jointly ruled over Sparta, both of whom claimed descent from the legendary hero Heracles. As the 3rd son of King Anaxandridas II, he was not expected to become king, but he would, in the end, succeed to the kingship and become one of the most legendary figures of classical antiquity. Despite this reputation, little is known about Leonidas's life, and the main source of what we do know comes from the histories of Herodotus, the 5th century BC historian nicknamed the Father of History, who was the first writer to take an investigative approach towards events of the past. However, Herodotus was also notorious for embellishing his accounts of Greek history, and this makes determining the details of Leonidas's life additionally difficult. The city-state of Sparta, also known by the ancient Greeks as Lacedaemon, was located on the Eurotas River in the southeastern portion of the Peloponnese, the peninsula connected to the rest of Greece via the Isthmus of Corinth. The Peloponnese had been settled by the Achaeans, one of the 4 major Greek ethnic groups, during the early period of Greek history. Sparta was home to the legendary King Menelaus, who led the Spartans in the Trojan War and fought to rescue his wife Helen after her abduction by the Trojan prince Paris. Menelaus is said to have ruled from the hilltop town of Thermopylae, while classical Sparta was founded on lower ground near the Eurotas by the Dorians from the east. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta was not properly urbanized and was more of a collection of villages. The town of Sparta itself was divided into the 4 villages of Petana, Limnae, Massoa, and Cynosura. The 4 villages, together with that of Amyclae to the south, collectively formed the city-state of Sparta. Since the 900s BC, Sparta was jointly ruled by 2 kings of the Aegeid and Eurypontid dynasties. The Spartans owed their constitution, known as the Great Retra, to a legendary figure called Lycurgus, who is said to have introduced his reforms around the 7th century BC. Under this system, the 2 kings of Sparta served as commanders of the army and were also members of the Gerousia, a council of elders whose membership included 28 other men aged at least 60 who were elected for life. In addition to serving as the Supreme Court, the Gerousia debated political issues before they were put to a vote in the assembly. They also had the power to veto the assembly's decisions. The members of the assembly were Sparta's full citizens, all of whom had to be of legitimate Spartan birth, and each underwent a rigorous training regime to serve in the Spartan army during their youth. Every year, the assembly elected a council of 5 ephors, 1 for each of the 5 villages who shared executive power with the kings, and sometimes overruled them. The ephors had extensive powers over foreign relations and served as ambassadors. Additionally, 2 ephors would always accompany the king on military campaigns and could put him on trial for misconduct. By the middle of the 7th century BC, Sparta had a formidable hoplite army. Hoplites were heavy infantrymen who fought in phalanxes 8 ranks deep, distinguished by a wooden round shield, faced in bronze and decorated with the Greek letter lambda for Lacedaemon, which they carried on their left arm. They wore a large bronze helmet, a bronze breastplate, bronze abdominal guard, and greaves. Their main weapon was a long wooden spear with an iron tip, and they also carried a short sword for close combat. Spartan hoplites were distinguished from other Greek warriors by their long hair and long red cloaks. Sparta was a very religious society, and its kings would make sacrifices and consult oracles before going on campaign. Even in the heat of battle, Spartan commanders were known to take time to make sacrifices to inform their decisions. They had a unique attitude to death, considering it a badge of honor to be killed in battle, while survival in defeat was a humiliation. These customs and values were instilled into the Spartans from a young age. As a warrior society, boys of legitimate Spartan birth were separated from their families from the age of 7 and brought up in the compulsory agogay system, where they would be raised by young Spartan adults who trained them as warriors. At the age of 18, the graduates with the greatest potential would join an elite military unit who served as members of the royal bodyguard of 300 men, senior army commanders, and would eventually become candidates for the Gerousia. The only Spartan boys exempted from the agoge were the crown princes of the two royal houses. As Leonidas was not his father's eldest son, he would have joined his brothers Dorius and Cleombrotus in the arduous training regime. The elite Spartans were also members of a secret service called the Crypteia, whose main function was to control the Helots, the lower class of Spartan society who were effectively exploited as slaves, and had once been from neighboring states such as Messenia, which were brought under Spartan domination from the 8th century onwards. Since the Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans, the Spartan constitution included measures to keep them under control. After a new set of ephors took office in the autumn, they would issue a declaration of war on the Helots, which allowed free Spartans to kill the Helots without being punished. A third class, which existed between the Spartans and Helots, were known as Perioeci, and these were men from neighboring towns and villages who were free subjects of the Spartans with obligations to serve in the army. As the Spartans were banned from engaging in any economic activities, the Perioeci served as merchants and craftsmen, making the armor and weapons for the Spartan military. Sparta was just one of over 1,000 city-states dotted around on the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts, from the Straits of Gibraltar in the west to modern-day Georgia in the east, which collectively made up the Greek or Hellenic world. Although these communities were connected by a shared language, culture, and religion, they were independent entities who would often fight each other over control of land and economic resources. Most Greeks lived in Europe, but there was also a large population in Western Asia and a handful of settlements in North Africa along the coastline of places such as Cyrene, the ancient name for Libya. By the 6th century, many of these city-states had become democracies, but some continued to retain their kings or had been taken over by dictators and tyrants. Sparta was unique in being a diarchy with two kings. Around the time of Leonidas's birth, the most important and powerful city-states in mainland Greece included Thebes, Corinth, Argos, Sparta, and Athens. These city-states would then establish colonies further afield, some of which would become powerful city-states in their own right. Syracuse in Sicily was founded by Corinth. Ephesus in Turkey was founded by Athens, while modern-day Naples in Italy, which was known as Neapolis in ancient times, was initially settled by sailors from Rhodes. The only overseas colony founded by Sparta was that of Taras, modern-day Taranto in southern Italy. Unlike other Greek city-states, the Spartans satisfied the need for land by conquering the neighboring regions of Laconia and Messenia to the south and west. By the middle of the 6th century BC, the Spartans turned their attention to the region of Arcadia in the north. In around 550 BC, during the reign of Leonidas's father, Anaxandridas, the Spartans marched into battle against the Arcadian city-state of Tegea, carrying rods with which they would divide the land they expected to conquer, and chains to shackle the prisoners they expected to capture. Instead, they suffered an unexpected defeat and ended up wearing the same chains as prisoners of war. The setback at the so-called Battle of Fetters prompted Sparta to change its policy from one of conquest to one of diplomacy under the influence of an ephor named Chilon. The Spartans soon claimed to have discovered the bones of Orestes and Tisamenus, the legendary son and grandson of King Agamemnon, the elder brother of Menelaus, and supreme commander of the Greeks in the Trojan War. By bringing these remains back to Sparta for reburial, they claimed the inheritance of the Achaean kings, and by extension, the whole of the Peloponnese. Through these and other means, the Lacedaemonians were able to secure an alliance with Tegea. Over the course of the second half of the 6th century BC, these diplomatic initiatives led to the formation of an alliance known as the Peloponnesian League. Sparta was the leading power of the alliance and was not bound by reciprocal obligations to defend its allies. The one major Peloponnesian city-state which remained outside the League was Argos, a traditional rival which unsuccessfully challenged Spartan dominance in battle on several occasions in the 6th century BC. The death of Anaxandridas II in around 520 BC led to a succession crisis between his sons Cleomenes and Dorius. While Dorius claimed seniority as the son of his father's first wife, and on account of his military prowess by going through the Agoge, the Spartans kept a tradition and acknowledged their elder Cleomenes as the rightful king. After his failed attempt at claiming the crown for himself, Dorius tried unsuccessfully to found a Spartan colony in North Africa and later Sicily, but was killed in battle against the Carthaginians in Sicily in around 510 BC. Cleomenes proved to be an effective king whose influence extended across much of the Greek world. In 510 BC, he led a land invasion of Athens that resulted in the expulsion of the tyrant Hippias and his sons. The Spartan intervention enabled the Athenian politician Cleisthenes to establish a democratic government, and in 507 BC, Cleomenes responded to the calls of the pro-Spartan politician Isagoras to overthrow Cleisthenes and install an oligarchy. Although the Spartans managed to occupy the Athenian Acropolis, the people declared in favor of Cleisthenes and forced the Spartan king to withdraw, sending Isagoras into exile in the process. The failed intervention prompted Cleomenes to lead a large Peloponnesian army alongside his co-king of the Eurypontid royal house, Demaratus, against Athens the following year. The campaign of 506 BC proved unsuccessful when the army disintegrated after the Corinthians decided to withdraw their forces halfway through, following which King Demaratus also abandoned the army. Following the incident, Sparta agreed to create a Congress of the Peloponnesian League, where the allies could vote for or against military action. In order to prevent future disagreements on campaign, the Spartans also changed their constitution, forbidding the two reigning kings from leading the Spartan army on campaign together at the same time. According to Herodotus, the Agiad and Eurypontid kings of Sparta tended to view each other with suspicion and hatred, and after 506 BC, the disagreements between Cleomenes and Demaratus were not only political but personal. This animosity continued for many years. In 494 BC, after defeating Argos in battle, Cleomenes was put on trial for failing to capture Argos itself. It is likely that Demaratus was behind the initiative. On this occasion, Cleomenes successfully defended himself and was acquitted when placed on trial before the ephors. Then, in 491 BC, following another disagreement between the two men, Cleomenes deposed his co-king and bribed the oracle at Delphi to declare that Demaratus was the illegitimate son of his father, King Ariston, and therefore his deposition was divinely sanctioned. Soon afterwards, the bribery was discovered, and Cleomenes is said to have gone mad and went into exile. He was then recalled to Sparta and arrested by the authorities. His accusers on this latter occasion may have included his brothers Leonidas and Cleombrotus. After being placed in prison with a helot guard, he soon persuaded one of the guards to give him a knife and killed himself. Herodotus presents a number of alternative theories for the king's madness and suicide, the most common being that he had angered the gods when he bribed the oracle at Delphi, and his descent into insanity was divine retribution. The historian Paul Cartledge has raised the possibility that Cleomenes' death was not a suicide, but that he was actually murdered by his half-brother Leonidas, who was next in line to the Agiad throne and who succeeded Cleomenes as King Leonidas I in 489 BC. By the time he became king, Leonidas was married to Gorgo, the daughter and only child of Cleomenes. As Gorgo was born around 510 BC, the marriage would have taken place in the late 490s, when Gorgo was in her late teens and Leonidas was already around 50 years old. Marriage between close blood relatives was not uncommon for the Spartan royal houses, and Leonidas's own father and mother had been uncle and niece. Furthermore, as Gorgo was Cleomenes' only child and stood to inherit all his wealth, Leonidas would reunite a large part of his father's inheritance that had been divided among his 4 sons. Leonidas came to the throne towards the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars, which saw Greek city-states in Ionia on the western coast of modern-day Turkey clash with the rapidly expanding Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was founded in the 550s BC by Cyrus II of Anshan, a client king of the Median Empire, ruled by his maternal grandfather, King Astyages. Both of these empires were based initially out of the region around modern-day Iran. In 553 BC, Cyrus rebelled against his grandfather, and by 550 BC, he captured the Median capital of Ecbatana, overthrowing Astyages' empire and proclaiming himself King of Kings. Upon learning of this, King Croesus of Lydia in western Anatolia, the region around western Turkey along the coast of the Aegean Sea, sought to take advantage of the collapse of the Medes and consulted the Delphic oracle, which informed him that he would destroy a great empire if he were to launch an invasion. Confident of victory, Croesus invaded Cyrus's empire from the west, only for the Persian king to counterattack and overrun Lydia by 546 BC, deposing Croesus and transforming the region into a Persian province. In 539 BC, Cyrus also captured Babylon and allowed the captive Jewish population to return to their ancestral home in Jerusalem. The great king then turned his attention east, where he managed to establish tributary relationships in India, but generally faced greater resistance. He is said to have died in battle in Central Asia, fighting against an army led by Queen Tomiris of the Massagetae in 530 BC. The Persian Empire continued its expansion under Cyrus's son and successor, Cambyses II, who conquered Egypt and the Levant during his brief reign. Cambyses' death in 522 BC led to a power struggle which eventually resulted in the accession of Darius I, a powerful warrior who married Cyrus's daughter Atossa and claimed to be distantly related to the Persian royal house. After his coronation at Cyrus's capital of Pasargadae in around 515 BC, he established a ceremonial capital at Persepolis in the region of Fars in southern Iran, though the main administrative center was in Susa, around 160 miles to the east of the Tigris River. In 513 BC, Darius embarked on his Scythian campaign, during which he built a pontoon bridge to convey his army across the Bosporus Straits into European Thrace, a region covering parts of modern-day Bulgaria, northwestern Turkey, and northeastern Greece. Although he struggled to defeat the nomadic Scythians, Darius subjugated the Thracians and forced King Amyntas of Macedonia to submit to his empire as a vassal. These new conquests strengthened the Persian Empire's northwest frontier and served as a base for further incursions into Greece. By 500 BC, Darius ruled over a vast multi-ethnic empire, which incorporated Indians in the east and Greeks in the west, and he set about reorganizing his father-in-law's disparate conquests in order to administer the provinces more effectively. Darius introduced a universal currency known as the Daric in his honor. He also divided the empire into around 20 provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. Each of these governors was required to provide a minimum annual tax or tribute as well as military obligations, and the satraps were expected to collect these taxes and raise contingents of soldiers on behalf of the great king. Although the Persian kings were Zoroastrians, who claimed to be representatives of the god Ahura Mazda, or Lord Wisdom, they were generally tolerant of other religions and were satisfied as long as they received the taxes and tributes they demanded from their imperial subjects in each of the provinces. By the end of the 6th century BC, many of the Greeks in the Persian Empire in Lydia and Ionia were unhappy with Persian rule, and in 499 BC, the Ionian revolt broke out under the leadership of Aristagoras, tyrant of the city-state of Miletus in southwestern Anatolia. Although several Greek regions rose up in revolt, the rebels needed alliances with the powerful city-states on the Greek mainland in order to stand any chance of defeating the mighty Persian Empire. Aristagoras personally went to Sparta to ask for aid from King Cleomenes, claiming untruthfully that the Persians could be easily defeated. This was not the first time the Spartans had received a request for military assistance against the Persians. A half-century earlier, King Croesus of Lydia had recognized Sparta as the most powerful city-state in the Greek world, and when he faced a counter-invasion of Lydia by Cyrus's armies in the 440s BC, Croesus requested military assistance from Sparta, which on this occasion decided to only send a diplomatic envoy to warn Cyrus not to invade Lydia. By the time the Spartan arrived, Cyrus had already occupied the Lydian capital of Sardis. When Cleomenes asked how long it would take to get to Persia, Aristagoras informed him that it would take 3 months to march overland from Ionia to Susa. When Cleomenes refused, due to the great distances involved, Aristagoras informed the Spartan king of the great wealth of the Persian Empire and attempted to bribe him, gradually increasing his offer. According to Herodotus, Aristagoras eventually offered Cleomenes 50 talents of silver, an enormous sum of money at the time, but Cleomenes' daughter, and Leonidas' future wife Gorgo, who was not yet 10 years old, warned her father not to become corrupt and urged him to dismiss the foreigner. After Sparta's refusal to help, Aristagoras went to Athens and made the same arguments in an attempt to obtain Athenian assistance. As the Athenians claimed leadership of the Ionian Greeks and had recently survived attempts by the former tyrant Hippias to overthrow their nascent democracy with Persian support, they agreed to support the revolt and joined the Ionians and Eretrians in sacking the Lydian capital of Sardis in 498 BC. Later that year, the allies were defeated by the Persians at the Battle of Ephesus, and Athens withdrew from the alliance. The revolt continued until 494 BC, when a Persian fleet defeated the Ionians at the naval battle of Lade, near Miletus. After restoring his control over Ionia, Darius planned an invasion of Greece, both to punish Athens and Eretria for siding with the rebels and to reduce the threat of the Greek city-states joining together to attack the empire again. Thus, in 492 BC, Darius's son-in-law and nephew, Mardonius, led a campaign to re-establish Persian authority over Thrace and forced Macedonia to give up its previous autonomy. But any further incursions into Greece were frustrated when most of the Persian fleet was shipwrecked near Mount Athos. The following year, the Persian king sent ambassadors to all the Greek states seeking their submission to Persian authority. Athens and Sparta signaled their refusal to submit by killing the Persian envoys, but a direct showdown between the Greeks and the Persians was drawing near. In 491 BC, King Cleomenes of Sparta had tried to use his influence to create an anti-Persian alliance between Athens and the nearby island city-state of Aegina, which had recently submitted to Persia. But his efforts at fostering Greek unity against the Persian threat were undermined by King Demaratus back home in Sparta, who criticized his co-king for siding with Athens, a traditional enemy against Aegina, a long-standing ally of Sparta. Demaratus's conspiring against Cleomenes led directly to the latter maneuvering to depose the former. After being mocked in public by his successor Leotychitus II, Demaratus left Sparta and took refuge in Persia, where he was given land by King Darius. In 490 BC, Darius launched an amphibious invasion of Greece, led by his nephew Artaphanes and a general named Datis. After easily subduing Eretria and burning the city to the ground, the Persians turned their attention to Athens. Although the Athenians were an emerging naval power, they did not yet have the capability to prevent the Persian army from landing at the Bay of Marathon, around 25 miles to the east from Athens. The Athenians sent the long-distance runner Phidippides to request help from Sparta. It's uncertain if Cleomenes or Leonidas was king at the time, but when the Athenian arrived after running over 150 miles in 48 hours, the Spartans agreed to send 2,000 hoplites. However, they stated that they could not leave until a religious festival which was being celebrated in Sparta at the time was over. As a result, by the time these Spartans arrived, the Athenians and Persians had already fought the Battle of Marathon. The Athenian army was commanded by Miltiades, who had previously ruled over an Athenian colony in Thrace and fought under Darius in his Scythian campaign of 513 BC, before siding with Aristagoras in the Ionian Revolt. Armed with his experience of Persian warfare, Miltiades deployed his army to block the exits of the plain of Marathon. After several days, the Persians decided to sail their army straight to Athens. While the Persian cavalry were embarking from their ships, Miltiades led his army of 10,000 men to attack the flanks of the Persian infantry before turning towards the center. Over 6,000 Persians were killed during the battle, at the cost of 192 Athenian dead, and an unknown number of casualties among Athens' allies from the city of Plataea. The Persians abandoned their ambitions to conquer Athens and returned home. This was the background against which Leonidas became one of Sparta's two kings. Not much is known about what happened in Sparta in the 480s BC after Leonidas became king. Although the Persians had been defeated at Marathon, the Spartans, Athenians, and others fully expected that they would return before long. Darius died in 486 BC, without fulfilling his ambitions to conquer Greece, and was succeeded by his son Xerxes. After restoring internal order within his empire, he resolved to complete his father's unfinished work and made preparations for a campaign to defeat and subjugate the Greeks once and for all. News of these preparations reached Sparta in around 484 BC. Regretting the earlier decision to kill the Persian envoy sent by Darius in 491 BC, the Spartans decided to send a human sacrifice to the Persians in an attempt to appease the gods for their sacrilegious deed 7 years earlier. 2 men volunteered for the sacrificial mission, and both were sent on the journey. But when they arrived at Xerxes' court at Susa and informed the great king of the proposed sacrifice, Xerxes laughed and considered it a joke. The cultural misunderstanding may have spared the lives of the 2 Spartans, but preparations for the invasion of Greece continued as before. As part of his preparations, Xerxes ordered a canal to be dug through Mount Athos in northeastern Greece, hoping to prevent a repeat of the disaster when the Persian fleet had attempted to go round the Athos promontory during Mardonius's invasion of 492 BC. Xerxes also ordered the construction of a bridge of boats across the Bosporus or Hellespont, like Darius had done more than 20 years earlier when he first conquered Thrace. Unlike his father, Xerxes took steps to prevent any sabotage of these invasion plans by ensuring that his Greek subjects were not involved in the project. Instead, he ordered his Phoenician and Egyptian subjects to chain the boats together with thick papyrus rope. Xerxes could also count on a large contingent of Greek subjects, including the Thracians and Macedonians. Many Greek city-states which retained monarchies preferred the protection offered by the Persian Empire to the prospect of being overthrown by a democratic revolution, and despite attempts by Herodotus to give the impression of a united Greek resistance to this latest Persian invasion, it is likely that more Greeks fought for Xerxes than against him when he launched the latest Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Sparta was the first of the Greek city-states to be warned of an imminent Persian invasion. According to Herodotus, the deposed king Demaratus, who was in exile in the Persian Empire, continued to sympathize with his native land and decided to send a warning to Sparta. In order to keep the message secret, he inscribed it on a wooden tablet which he covered with wax to conceal the message. When the item arrived in Sparta, everyone was confused as to what it meant, but Leonidas's wife, Gorgo, suspected that there could be a hidden message underneath and suggested removing the wax. After the wax was burned away, Demaratus's message was revealed, and the Spartans passed on the warning to the other Greek city-states. While Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian League served as a powerful armed force on land, the Greeks continued to lack a major naval force. The Athenian political leader, Themistocles, who emerged as the most influential politician in Athens during the 480s BC, was a keen advocate for Athens to build its naval capacity in order to resist a Persian invasion fleet. In 483 BC, Themistocles exploited the discovery of a rich seam in the silver mines at Laurium and proposed to the Athenian assembly that the silver should be used to finance the construction of a fleet of 100 or 200 new triremes, the fast and agile warships named after their 3 tiers of oars. As the Persian threat was considered rather distant for the time being, Themistocles claimed that the fleet was to be used against Aegina, which had inflicted a series of naval defeats upon Athens since siding with the Persians in 491 BC. The assembly voted in favor of the proposal, allowing Athens to build a fleet capable of confronting the Persians. Thus, by the time Xerxes began his final preparations for the invasion of Greece in 480 BC, the oracle at Delphi was able to inform envoys from Athens that while their city would be destroyed, the wooden wall shall remain unconquered. While some Athenians claimed that the oracle referred to the hedges that used to surround the Acropolis, Themistocles convinced his fellow Athenians to place their faith in his navy, which he believed was the wooden wall, which the oracle was referring to as the salvation of Athens. In 481 BC, the representatives of the Greek city-states which sought to resist the imminent Persian invasion met at the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow neck of land between the Peloponnese and northern Greece, where they agreed on a mutual defensive pact, bound as they were by religious, linguistic, and cultural ties. The alliance included 31 city-states, half of which were members of the Peloponnesian League or otherwise associated with Sparta. Given its preeminent position among the city-states, Sparta was the undisputed leader of the coalition, and Spartan military commanders would lead the allied Greek forces on both land and sea during the war, even though the Spartans were not known for their naval prowess. On land, however, there was no disputing King Leonidas' credentials to lead the allied army. In the spring of 480 BC, Xerxes finally led his invasion force across the pontoon bridges he had painstakingly constructed over the Hellespont in the past few years. While Herodotus claimed that the invasion force numbered over 2 million men, based on the capacity of the Persian Empire at the time, it is unlikely that Xerxes' army would have exceeded more than 200,000 men. Herodotus claims that the invasion force included up to 60 ethnic groups, including Persians, Medes, and Parthians from Iran, Bactrians from the region around modern-day Afghanistan, Indians from what is now the Punjab, as well as a wide array of other subject peoples, such as the Lydians, Arabians, Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and even many Greeks. The Persian force included the 10,000-strong royal bodyguard known as the Immortals, who were commanded by a nobleman named Hydarnes. According to Herodotus, the Persian fleet numbered over 1,000 ships, including large contingents from the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, and more than 300 ships from the king's Asian Greek subjects. Among the latter were 5 warships commanded by a woman named Artemisia, who was queen of Halicarnassus. The large Persian army proceeded at a slow pace through northern Greece, partly as a result of the army's long supply train, and partly due to Xerxes' desire to use its imposing presence to present a sense of inevitable victory which would convince wavering Greeks to submit to Persian rule. In July, the Persians approached the Vale of the Tempe, on the border between Macedonia and Thessaly. An allied Greek army of 10,000 men, under the joint command of the Athenian Themistocles and a Spartan named Leonidas, awaited the invading force. When King Alexander I of Macedonia alerted the allied army of the imminent arrival of Xerxes, he informed Themistocles and Leonidas not only of the vast numbers of men and ships in the invading force, but also that the Allied defenses could be outflanked. This information prompted the Allied army to withdraw and return to the Isthmus of Corinth for further deliberations. The wavering Thessalians submitted easily to the Persians, allowing Xerxes to continue his march south without much difficulty. In the meantime, the Persian fleet sailed to Cape Sepias, opposite the island of Euboea. After withdrawing from their first defensive position, the Greek allies decided to resist the Persians by land at the pass of Thermopylae and by sea at nearby Cape Artemisium on the northern tip of Euboea. Despite the desperate military situation, the religious calendar proved a complicating factor for the Greek coalition, as the Olympic Games were due to be held that August. Held in honor of Zeus, king of the gods, the Olympian Games were one of 4 pan-Hellenic games which brought together athletes and spectators from all over the Greek world. Sparta's religious obligations were twofold, as they were also preparing for the annual Carneia festival in honor of the god Apollo. Nevertheless, as leaders of the anti-Persian coalition, the Spartans had to send an army to Thermopylae as a gesture of resistance. Otherwise, the coalition could easily fall apart, with individual city-states siding with Xerxes in the face of his advancing army. Furthermore, the Spartans had consulted the oracle at Delphi, which had informed them that either Sparta would be occupied by the Persians, or they would be mourning the death of a king. Guided by these considerations, Sparta sent King Leonidas and a small army of 300 hoplites for the defense of Thermopylae. Although this was a small percentage of the 8,000 or so Spartan warriors available, most of the 300 would have been part of the elite royal bodyguard. Leonidas also stipulated that the men who accompanied him were to have a living son, a sign perhaps that the king was convinced, perhaps owing to the oracle's declaration, that he and his 300 men were destined to die in battle. Accordingly, he wished to ensure that each of the 300 men's family line could be continued by their surviving sons. When Leonidas left for Thermopylae, he advised his wife Gorgo to, quote, marry a good man and have good sons, though they already had a young son of their own named Pleistarchus. With this done, Leonidas and the 300 marched to Thermopylae, perhaps aware that death awaited them there. It is this spirit which led 2 men to volunteer to sacrifice themselves to the Persians in the name of peace in 484 BC, only to be misunderstood by Xerxes. Such misunderstandings were less likely during Xerxes' invasion of 480 BC, as he had with him a prominent Spartan advisor, the same Demaratus who had been removed as king of Sparta by Cleomenes 11 years before. Earlier in the campaign, the great king asked him whether the Greeks would be motivated to resist. Demaratus replied that his fellow Spartans, quote, will fight as no others, no matter how few against however many, and that they were accustomed not to retreat from the battlefield even when outnumbered, to stay in formation, and either to win or to die. However, Xerxes foolishly dismissed the very notion that men would fight so courageously of their own volition. In addition to the 300 elite hoplites, the Spartan army also included around 1,000 perioeci and the same number of helots. These were reinforced by small contingents of Peloponnesian allies, allowing Leonidas to march to Thermopylae with around 4,000 men. As they approached the pass in northern Greece, the coalition army was joined by 1,100 Boeotians and contingents from the neighboring Locrians and Phocians, each of whom contributed around 1,000 men. Adding all these disparate contingents together, Leonidas commanded an army of some 7,000 men at Thermopylae, awaiting the Persian horde. The name Thermopylae means hot gates in Greek. This describes a narrow pass between the Kallidroman Massif, a mountain to the west, and the Gulf of Maliarchos to the east. There were 3 such gates through the region. Leonidas deployed most of his men at the middle gate, a 15 to 20 meter long stretch at the narrowest point of the pass. The gate was already protected by an existing Phocian wall, and upon their arrival, the Greeks began to refurbish it. Leonidas was soon informed by men from nearby Trachis that there was a narrow mountain path called Anapia, which snaked around the pass and emerged around the east gate to the rear of the Greek position. Accordingly, the Spartan king ordered his 1,000-strong Phocian contingent to guard the path, which was so narrow that in places men could only advance in single file. Any attempt by the Persian fleet to attack the Greek position from the sea was protected by the Greek fleet at Artemisium, commanded officially by the Spartan Eurybiades, but in effect by Themistocles. Leonidas's Peloponnesian allies may have hoped that Xerxes would not arrive until the end of the Olympic Games, and their home cities would have time to summon their full contingents to do battle at Thermopylae. But the Persian army arrived in mid-August, with the religious festivities still ongoing. At this juncture, the Peloponnesians suggested to Leonidas that they should withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth and await further reinforcements there. The king of Sparta briefly considered this, but protests from the local Locrians and Phocians at the prospect of being abandoned to face the Persians alone prompted Leonidas to keep his army at Thermopylae, while sending messengers to allied city-states to request reinforcements as soon as possible. A famous incident occurred at this time when a soldier complained to Leonidas that the Persian army was so large that its arrows would blot out the sun. The Spartan king, unfazed by such a daunting prospect, remarked that if that were so, the Greeks would have a comfortable time fighting in the shade. However, Herodotus attributes the quote to a Spartan warrior named Dionysius. When Xerxes was deploying his army at the western end of the pass, he sent a scout on horseback to find out what the Greeks were up to. The scout returned to report that he had seen a small number of Greeks doing gymnastic exercises in the nude, while others were combing their long hair. The report astonished the great king, who summoned Demaratus to explain the seemingly effeminate behavior. Demaratus immediately recognized these men as Spartans and informed Xerxes that by dressing their hair, they were performing a ritual as part of their preparations to fight to the death. Xerxes had come to distrust Demaratus by this time, and took this warning lightly, dismissing the notion that these men were the boldest and noblest of all the Greeks. Expecting that sooner or later Leonidas and his men would take flight, Xerxes waited for 4 or 5 days until he finally decided to attack on the 17th of August, 480 BC. Before doing so, he sent an envoy to Leonidas, promising the Greeks their freedom and lands in Asia if they surrendered. After the Persian envoy was refused, he returned with a message from Xerxes, asking Leonidas and his men to hand over their weapons. In response, the king of Sparta uttered a characteristically brief 2-word challenge, "Molon labe," come and take them. Xerxes answered Leonidas's challenge by sending a 2,000-strong Median contingent who were among the best soldiers in his army against the Greeks. However, the lightly armed Medes were unable to make much progress, and hundreds fell as they clashed with the heavily armed Spartan hoplites. The Median javelins were much shorter than the hoplite spears, and the narrow confines of the pass at Thermopylae negated the advantage of numbers that the Persians enjoyed. The Spartans also enjoyed tactical superiority, and their high level of discipline enabled Leonidas to rotate his men at the front line behind the Phocian wall at regular intervals to ensure that the men fought as effectively as possible. Leonidas also successfully ordered his men to stage feigned retreats before wheeling them around and inflicting maximum damage on the enemy forces, which had begun to advance in a chaotic fashion. Increasingly frustrated by the inability of his army to overcome the resistance of a tiny Greek hoplite army, Xerxes ordered his elite immortals into the fray, but even they could make no progress against the wall of Spartan shields and fell back with heavy losses. Thus ended the first day of hostilities. Xerxes knew he had a genuine problem on his hands at the end of it. On the second day of battle, Xerxes continued his frontal assault of the pass, launching wave after wave of men against the Greek hoplite wall. As the Persian king rued a second day of no progress, a local man named Ephialtes arrived at the Persian camp, offering information that would enable the Persians to win the battle. Expecting a huge reward from the great king, the infamous traitor informed Xerxes that it was possible to circumvent the Greek position by taking the narrow Anopia mountain path. Xerxes at once investigated this possibility and ordered Hydarnes to lead his immortals on a special mission. With Ephialtes serving as their guide, Hydarnes and his men set off at nightfall and climbed the mountain path in the middle of the night. During the early hours of the third day of battle, the Phocian contingent detached by Leonidas to guard the route heard the rustling of leaves signaling the unexpected advance of the immortals and hurried to arm themselves for battle. An equally surprised Hydarnes feared that these were Spartans, but after Ephialtes informed him that they were not, the immortals managed to overcome the inexperienced Phocian hoplites and descended into the Thermopylae Pass, east of the Middle Gate. As a result of these developments, on the morning of the third day, Leonidas and his men faced being trapped in a pincer to the east and west. When the Spartan royal diviner Megistias carried out his sacrifice that morning, he read the signs of impending death, which would hardly have come as a surprise. Leonidas and his subordinate commanders decided what to do, now that their position was untenable. The account given by Herodotus states that Leonidas dismissed his allies after recognizing that they were unwilling to continue the fight. The king himself decided to continue the fight with what remained of the 300 Spartans, the Perioeci and Helots, as well as the Boeotians, who chose to stay and fight. It is equally likely, perhaps more so, that the allied contingents withdrew in fear without any orders from Leonidas. That the Spartans decided to stay and fight until the bitter end was fully expected of their warrior culture, and Leonidas might also have been persuaded to stay by the message from the oracle that a Spartan king would have to die to spare Sparta from the Persian horde. As the remainder of his army prepared to take breakfast that morning, Leonidas is supposed to have said to them, "This evening we shall dine in Hades." After 9 o'clock on the morning of the third day of battle, Xerxes launched his assault. Leonidas and the remaining Greeks made their last stand in front of the Phocian wall. With nothing to lose except their lives, they fought like men possessed and inflicted more casualties on the enemy than in the previous 2 days. After their spears broke, the Greeks took their swords in hand and charged against the enemy, fighting hand to hand. King Leonidas fell in the melee, and the Greeks and Persians fought over possession of the dead king's body. Although the Greeks were initially successful at retrieving their fallen leader's corpse, once the outflanking maneuver was complete and they were trapped in the rear, the remaining Greeks retreated to a small hill where they fought to the end, with only the Thebans surrendering to the Persians. Of the 300 Spartans who accompanied Leonidas to Thermopylae, only 2 survived, neither of whom fought in the battle. A man named Pantites had been absent because Leonidas sent him on a diplomatic mission to Thessaly, and when he realized he missed the battle, he hanged himself in shame. A second man, Aristodemus, was unable to fight due to an eye infection. Even though a fellow member of the 300, named Eurytus, had been suffering from the same illness, he ordered his helot attendant to lead him into the battle, acting as his eyes on the battlefield, where he met his end. Upon his return to Sparta, Aristodemus was subjected to humiliation from his fellow citizens, and at the Battle of Plataea the following year, he attempted to redeem himself by breaking ranks and charging alone into the midst of the enemy. Although the Greeks lost up to 4,000 men at Thermopylae, over 20,000 Persians fell during the battle, including 2 of Xerxes' half-brothers. Infuriated by how much blood he had to expend in order to eliminate such a small enemy force, once the Persians recaptured Leonidas's body, Xerxes ordered the dead king to be decapitated and his head displayed on top of a pole. Herodotus noted that the Persians usually treated the bodies of fallen enemy warriors with great honor, indicating exactly how enraged Xerxes was by how Leonidas had managed to oversee the resistance at Thermopylae. The death of Leonidas led to the accession of his young son Pleistarchus as king. The fallen king's younger brother, Cleombrotus, was named regent for the underage Pleistarchus and also took over command of the coalition land forces in the Peloponnese. While Leonidas and his small army fought at Thermopylae, 271 Greek triremes fought with a Persian fleet of up to 800 ships at Artemisium. On the first day of battle, the Greeks sank 30 enemy ships, while a Persian detachment sent around the eastern coast of Euboea to outflank the Greeks was shipwrecked. After a day of relative calm, the Persian fleet launched a sustained assault on the Greek fleet, and both sides incurred considerable damage over the course of the day. When Themistocles received news of the defeat at Thermopylae, he realized that there was no longer any strategic value in remaining at Artemisium, and ordered the fleet to withdraw to Salamis on the Saronic Gulf to the west of Athens. On land, Cleombrotus prepared to make a stand on the Isthmus of Corinth by ordering his men to destroy the road leading through it and to build a defensive wall across the region. But as Athens was located in the region of Attica, located outside the wall, the Athenian citizens were ordered to abandon their city and evacuate to Salamis, and Themistocles was able to use the Athenian fleet to help out in the final stages of the evacuation. After the few remaining Athenians who barricaded themselves on the Acropolis were defeated, Xerxes ordered the city to be destroyed, and the Athenian Acropolis was razed to the ground, fulfilling another prophecy of the oracle at Delphi. Although Leonidas' stand at Thermopylae ended in defeat, and Xerxes' army continued its advance, the heroic defense of the pass inspired the Greeks to fight on, and the 3 days of fighting at Thermopylae provided much-needed time for Themistocles to inflict significant damage to the Persian fleet. The Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies anticipated that the next phase of the war would follow in a similar vein to that of Thermopylae and Artemisium, with the Peloponnesian army fighting to hold the choke point at the Isthmus of Corinth, while the allied navy held the Persian fleet in check at Salamis. But Themistocles had other ideas and believed it was possible to end the war by destroying the Persian fleet. Although he had received reinforcements since Artemisium and commanded a fleet of almost 400 ships, Themistocles was still outnumbered by the Persians. During the Battle of Salamis in late September, the Allied navy managed to win a decisive victory over the Persians, sinking over 200 enemy ships in the process. The naval battle marked the turning point of the war and prompted Xerxes to return home with much of his army, fearing that the Greek fleet might sail up the Hellespont and destroy his pontoon bridges to trap him in Greece. While Xerxes personally abandoned the campaign, the war was not yet over, and the Persians continued to occupy much of the Greek peninsula. The great king left behind a large force under the command of his cousin Mardonius, the same man who had led the invasion of Thrace in 492 BC. Now Mardonius evacuated Attica and spent the winter in Thessaly, while the Athenians reoccupied their native city and the Peloponnesians remained behind the Isthmus wall. Since the Athenians lacked the protection of the Isthmus wall, they urged the Spartans to lead an army north to attack and defeat Mardonius. When the Spartans refused, the Athenians withdrew their navy from the allied fleet, enabling King Leotychidas of Sparta to take command. In early 479 BC, Mardonius aimed to exploit the disagreements among the allies by sending a peace offering promising freedom to the Athenians. But this was rejected, prompting the Persian general to reoccupy Athens and completely destroy the city. The Athenian refugees appealed for military assistance from the Spartans, threatening to accept the Persian terms if none was given. After overseeing the completion of the Isthmus wall, Cleombrotus returned to Sparta and died soon afterwards, leaving his son, Pausanias, as regent and commander of the allied army. Pausanias raised an army of some 70,000 men, which marched north from the Isthmus, where they were joined by 8,000 Athenian hoplites. While Mardonius hoped to do battle on the open plains near Plataea, Pausanias managed to occupy a position on the heights overlooking the Persian camp. The two armies faced each other for several days before the Greeks decided on a strategic retreat to secure their lines of communication. As the Greeks were retreating in different directions, Mardonius led his army up the heights in pursuit, but, as at Thermopylae, the lightly armed Persians proved no match for the Greek hoplites, and Mardonius was killed in battle alongside more than half his army of some 120,000 men. At around the same time, King Leonidas sought battle with the Persian fleet and caught up to it at the foot of Mount Mycale in Ionia. Rather than do battle on their damaged ships, the Persian sailors joined a large army Xerxes had left there and did battle with the Spartans on foot with predictable consequences. The twin victories of Plataea and Mycale definitively ended any further attempts by Xerxes and his successors to invade Greece, and the invasion was abandoned. After the Persians evacuated Greece, the Greeks erected a stone lion at Thermopylae in memory of Leonidas, near the spot where he fell. They also raised a monument commemorating the dead with an epitaph composed by the poet Simonides, which read, quote, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to our laws we lie." Around 40 years after the battle, a Spartan delegation sent to Thermopylae recovered the supposed remains of Leonidas and carried them back to Sparta for reburial in a grand funeral. While the Spartans worshipped all their kings as semi-divine beings after their deaths, in later centuries, Leonidas was given the additional honor of an annual festival in his name, the Leonidaea. The focal point of the Spartan worship of the cult of Leonidas was a building known as the Leonidaion, which may have contained the funerary monuments of Leonidas and Pausanias, the two preeminent Spartan heroes of the Persian Wars. Even though we know very little about his life, in the centuries after his death, Leonidas served as a reminder to the Spartans of their former glory. The Roman emperors sought inspiration from the warrior tradition of Sparta, and the Leonidaea festival was revived during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD. The Greek historian and biographer Plutarch wrote a life of Leonidas, which has regrettably not survived. The legacy of Leonidas extends beyond the ancient world. During the Italian Renaissance, the independent city-states, threatened by French and German invasion, were inspired by Leonidas and the 300 as defenders of liberty against foreign tyranny. In the late 16th century, the prolific French essayist Michel de Montaigne claimed that Salamis, Plataea, and other Greek victories against Persia paled in comparison to the glorious defeat of King Leonidas and his men in the pass of Thermopylae. In 1814, the French neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David completed his canvas of Leonidas at Thermopylae. Although his patron, Napoleon Bonaparte, was initially puzzled as to why David would choose as his heroic subject an ancient warrior who succumbed to defeat, he later recognized the power of the Spartans' patriotic sacrifice. The example would have seemed extremely relevant as David completed his painting after Napoleon fought a valiant but ultimately unsuccessful campaign defending France from invasion by a coalition of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies. In his epic poem, Don Juan, the English romantic poet Lord Byron, who championed and later perished in the cause of Greek liberation, laments the lack of valor among his contemporary Greeks. "Earth, render back from out thy breast a remnant of our Spartan dead. Of the 300, grant but 3 to make a new Thermopylae." As the Royal Air Force faced the German Luftwaffe over the skies of southern England in the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill must have had Leonidas and the 300 in mind when he proclaimed, quote, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." Yet the legacy of Sparta was claimed not only by the Allies, but also by Nazi Germany. The organization of Spartan society, with a pure-born masterclass of warriors supported by an underclass of helots, served as a model for Hitler's racial utopia, and Hermann Goering alluded to the glory of the 300 when referring to the German Sixth Army surrounded by the Soviets at Stalingrad. The legacy of the Spartans, with Leonidas and the 300 as one of the most prominent examples, remains controversial and complex. While the 300 have gone down in history as the heroes of Thermopylae, the Helots and Perioeci, who had no choice but to comply with Leonidas's orders to fight to the death, have largely been forgotten. In spite of all the legends that have emerged concerning Leonidas's life over the centuries, we know surprisingly little about him. As the third son of King Anaxandridas, he went through the rigorous agoge training program alongside his two brothers, and was brought up to follow the principles of Sparta's warrior culture, including a sense of honor and glory in death. At around the age of 50, he married his wife, Gorgo, the daughter of his half-brother King Cleomenes, and not long afterwards may have been involved in his deposition and death, following which Leonidas became one of Sparta's co-kings. He would have played a leading role in Spartan deliberations over how to deal with the Persian threat, but he does not come into focus until the invasion of 480 BC. As commander of an understrength Greek army, weakened by religious obligations and a reluctance to face the enormous Persian horde, he decided to make a stand at Thermopylae, despite the poor numerical odds, offering unbreakable resistance and inflicting a considerable amount of damage on the Persian army over 2 full days. Even after being outflanked, he decided against withdrawing his whole army and fought a desperate rearguard action that inflicted a disproportionate number of casualties on the enemy before succumbing to the last man. While Leonidas and his army were defeated at Thermopylae, their brave resistance inspired the Greeks to triumph over the Persians at Salamis and Plataea. What do you think of King Leonidas I of Sparta? Was he a defender of freedom against a despotic imperial enemy? Or was he himself a despot who ruled over a state which routinely oppressed and humiliated its subject peoples in order to preserve the privileges and culture of a small warrior elite? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.